Candace Amber Farmer Owens. Candace Amber Owens Farmer. Candace Owens shouldn't need much introduction.
I don't know what Black Lives Matter was ever supposed to be about.
This is the greatest rigging of an American election.
I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism.
This is ironic because for all the things people know and believe about her, there's really a lot that people actually never talk about as it pertains to her story. She rose to the top of the MAGA movement in the mid to late 2010s as the most prominent Black face, or maybe even most prominent face, period, of the far right, which is interesting because she has spent most of the previous years before that aspiring to be a liberal pundit and a content creator in that lane. She was an intense critic of Donald Trump, allegedly writing an article speculating that Donald Trump had a small penis, an article aptly titled, "Does Donald Trump Actually Have a Small Penis?" by Candace Owens. Yes, this is real. It's mostly been scrubbed from the internet, but there's still traces of his existence out there, along with other paradoxes about Owens that are even easier to find. Owens came into the spotlight at the same time of the emergence of the alt-right, of which she was initially a target of. This targeting and harassment led Owens to create a website that she called the Social Autopsy that would basically be a library documenting the personal information of anonymous bullies and harassers. Remember, this was again the mid-2010s, right in the middle of Gamergate, when the anonymity of social media was allowing right-wing creators to hide behind masks or still images or comment sections, never having to be responsible for what they said, something that you'll find out later Owens really hated about the internet. Unfortunately for Owens, her idea for a website, which would essentially be a low-key doxing database, was widely rejected by everyone on the internet on all sides of the political divide. Most people recognize that such a site would only create avenues to destroy people's right to privacy, even if that meant the right to be shitty online anonymously. However, what she experienced is not what you might call a kind rejection. And here is where the Candace Owens that we would know today probably first emerges. In the rejection of this idea, she began to receive harassment and racial abuse online and in her inbox and DMs. This resounding rejection of mostly white people, something that I believe is highly damaging to Owens in particular, was hard for her to deal with. So much so that she began to believe that she was actually being conspired against, except in a twist, she doesn't think it was the army of alt-right trolls that had been harassing her this entire time, something that they were known to do, but instead she believed that she was the target of a complex plot by Zoe Quinn and Randy Harper, the two women who were the main targets of Gamergate at that time. For some reason, she felt they had coordinated to attack and destroy her in a 3D chess reverse pincer strategy using pre-modern bot farms. She crashed out about this secret attack against her online for days, similar to ways in which she's done so recently in the aftermath of the death of Charlie Kirk.
First and foremost, do not believe that Tyler Robinson killed Charlie Kirk. I want to be very clear on that.
Or her lawsuit from Emmanuel Macron.
The first sitting first lady of a country to file a lawsuit against a journalist of another country. You are literally making history in all the wrong ways.
Candace has this knack for tying together nonsensical threads with little evidence but a lot of passion in order to support whatever it is she's saying, and she vowed to unravel the complex, powerful forces against her, sliding further into madness the entire time.
As a result of her accidental slide into internet obsession, at a time when she could be figuring out how to address the numerous valid concerns the public has raised about her company, Owens is instead focusing laser-like on unraveling a conspiracy that only exists in the eyes of fevered Gamergaters and men's rights activists. "It makes no sense," she said of the outcry against Social Autopsy. "I'm telling you, there's a whole network that I'm pretty convinced it really is Gamergate. But it's bigger than Gamergate because the implications of it are so much heavier. How many organizations do this? How many organizations stand up on a stage and make sure this problem never fucking dies by faking harassment?" She's going to get to the bottom of this. She wants to position Social Autopsy in the vanguard of the fight against Quinn, Harper, and their nefarious allies.
So again, this is mid-2016 and Candace Owens is still a liberal, but that was about to change. In the aftermath of this event, Owens was contacted by then prominent figures in the alt-right anti-SAW world, such as Milo Yiannopoulos, who offered support, and according to Owens, she turned conservative overnight and a star was born. The main thing Owens learned from this experience is that truth and reality are optional for online engagement, attention, and income, which is why since 2016, we've seen her say some of the most unhinged and bizarre things possible without blinking.
Charlie Kirk thought that he was a time traveler. They practice incest and pedophilia as a sacramental right.
I don't know what Black Lives Matter was ever supposed to be about.
Which started earlier in her career with one of her first viral moments, low-key defending Hitler with her future partner in crime, Charlie Kirk.
I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. Globalism is what I don't want. So when you think about, whenever we say nationalism, the first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. You know, he was a National Socialist, but if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany.
This activity got her brought up in front of a congressional hearing where a House representative challenged her on this insane take. And I want you to watch what she does here.
So I'm going to play for you the first 30 seconds of a statement she made about Adolf Hitler.
He is assuming that Black people will not go pursue the full 2-hour clip. And he purposefully he cut off, and you didn't hear the question that was asked of me. He's trying to present as if I was launching a defense of Hitler in Germany, when in fact, the question that was asked of me was pertaining to whether or not I believed that whether or not I believed in nationalism, and that nationalism was bad. And what I responded to was that I do not believe that we should be characterizing Hitler as a nationalist.
Not long after this, she appeared in yet another hearing, this time about white supremacy, where she essentially said white supremacy isn't really a big deal and isn't a threat to the nation. Mind you, this was only a few years after Dylan Roof murdered 9 people in a Black church in South Carolina.
You know that white supremacy and white nationalism ranks nowhere near the top of the issues that are facing Black America. And the reason that you are bringing them up in this room is because it is attempt to make the election all about race, as the Democrats
Not in my case, Ms. Owens. I'm sorry. Please do not characterize my motive.
Mr. Chairman, it's my time.
Yeah, it's my time. You've got your time, Mr. Menez. I'll give you 3 more seconds.
Every 4 years, you bring up race, and you knew exactly what I meant when I said hilarious, and you just tried to do live what the media does all the time to Republicans, to our president, and to conservatives.
The shameless spin that you're seeing here from Owens is one of the most important and valuable tenets of modern media brand management, especially when you're on the right. Never play defense. It doesn't matter what you said, what you did, what the record clearly illustrates, what the history books say. No matter what, you stay on the attack. If you said something fucked up, it's being misinterpreted. It's a lie. It's actually correct if you look at it this way. Candace will even play the dreaded race card at times if she sees it fit.
He is assuming that Black people will not go pursue the full 2-hour clip.
As I said in my Charlie Kirk video last year, all that matters to Candace and her peers is that they get to spout right-wing rhetoric and propaganda to as many people as possible with impunity. It doesn't matter if it's debunked or disproved or pushed back against. The goal isn't to convince people, it's to infect people. America is a large country with well over 300 million people. Most people don't follow politics closely, let alone are well-versed in Black studies, gender studies, sociology, psychology, economics, whatever. But what they do have is common sense, a socially constructed framework of opinions that are near universal and intensely supported by most people, repeated and held up as truth, even when it's clearly not. Common sense like rich people create jobs or the police protect us, things that history and science and research have proven to be false, but people believe anyway, over and over and over again. What Owens and the right-wing administrators behind her recognized years prior, the Karl Roves, the Newt Gingriches, the Steve Bannons, etc., is that the truth doesn't matter when you're appealing to a population that's already inclined to agree with what you're saying based off cultural norms. They understand Brandolini's law. This law states that the amount of energy needed to refute misinformation is far more than the energy needed to spread it. As I pointed out in that Charlie Kirk video, right-wing pundits like Kirk and Owens, going all the way back to Rush Limbaugh, they've always been debunked, refuted, and defeated in the marketplace of ideals. It doesn't really make sense to sit and try to address anything they say because your effort is better used somewhere else. Because they are operating with common sense on their side, the fact of the matter is you'd have to refute entire frameworks of socially developed ideology in order to refute just some of the things they say. Remember this for later. I've recognized this about Owens and a lot of other political figures for years. Aside from the appeal of making content that will draw in a sizable audience, there's no amount of debunking you can do to stop Owens. Worse yet, because Owens is a Black woman, lots of people will likely use your valid criticism of her to be a license to get their anti-Black or misogynistic rocks off, making her a target for bad analysis as well. White liberals and leftists have a very bad habit of not knowing the line whenever someone Black is identified as their enemy. For a good example that will be more relevant later, see anti-Zionist pundit Norm Finkelstein calling neoliberal sellout Van Jones an Uncle Tom and the Yiddish N-word on Twitter just a few months back. Now, mind you, Van Jones is an Uncle Tom, but that is not Norm Finkelstein's term to use. What you realize is that Owens was almost designed in a lab to succeed in the right-wing media ecosystem, going from Breitbart to Turning Point USA and everywhere in between. Her Blackness gave her an edge to say some of the quiet things out loud that her white peers wouldn't be able to say. She was pretty and articulate and quick-witted, and she also had a knack for sincerely presenting bizarre asinine conspiracies and wild speculation as if they were hidden truths, as seen with her crusade against George Floyd, spreading the theory that he died from a fentanyl overdose that still plagues his story to this day.
George Floyd was not an amazing person. First and foremost, George Floyd at the time of his arrest was high on fentanyl and he was high on methamphetamine. This came back in both of his autopsy reports.
In 2020, she had probably her biggest glow up when she joined Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, an online network of right-wing media pundits, podcasts, and even some traditional TV shows. I can't fully tell how well her channel performed under them back then, but from what I found, she grew to well over 1 million subscribers in just a few years dealing with Ben Shapiro and the Daily Mail. She was not a household name per se, but by 2024, she was appearing everywhere, even managing to appear on the Joe Budden podcast and the Breakfast Club, two of the largest Black platforms that exist in media right now, which should never have happened. But at least Joe Budden had the wherewithal to hide it behind a paywall. Charlamagne just put her bullshit out there for the world to see. It is what it is. But this was also during a big, no pun intended, turning point for Owens. Those appearances on those two large Black podcasts both happened just a few weeks after she officially left the Daily Mail YouTube channel, or more than likely was fired. A job that probably paid her well and made her one of their top attractions. And that was odd for that to happen. Why would she leave the Wu-Tang Clan of conservative punditry? It's pretty easy to understand, really, but before I explain it, I do need to make one thing clear. This video is not about Candace Owens.
What is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And
for 4 generations, your boots up on their neck. October 7th happened. The did you expect? 9/11 happened. The did you expect? Bombs over Baghdad. There's blood over the checks. Zionists are the new Nazis. Netanyahu is the new Hitler. Bodies keep piling the up. America and Israel just get richer. New Jim Crow, but the same old shit. Everybody getting by the same old things. You can get blown up any time of the day, and the bombs all say made in USA. This is what it is. The IDF practices aiming low, cause they be shooting their kids. Wonder why they despise children, husband, and wives. And when somebody shoots back, they are surprised.
The bottom line is there is no safety. I can die at any moment. Like I can even die in my house, like 50 meters to my right here. They bombed a house, and 500 meters in that direction, they bombed the houses. And it is always so close to us. Like the street that we walk in every day, they bombed it more than 5-6 times so far. So no one is safe in Gaza. They are still bombing, still targeting people. They say that these are Hamas troops or Hamas soldiers, but we all know like this is not true. They are targeting everyone that they think that they threat to them. So it's not just about the resistance, but even about the idea of resisting. Like even me, my mom, she's scared that they might start targeting me if I started like getting more attention on the internet.
This will end up like getting your face a lot of places. Is it appropriate for me to like hide your face or anything like that?
No, I don't mind it. I'm not scared, to be honest. Like as I said, my mom, she's scared for me, but I am fine with it.
Okay.
And honestly, I should expect it. Like if I am going to keep going, doing what I am doing and be part of this and be wanting to be part of the change, I gotta accept some backlash, you know?
Right. On October 7, 2023, Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups led multiple attacks against Israel on the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. It was a multi-pronged surprise attack, the first of its kind since 1948, that led to over 1,000 deaths, with several hundred being non-military and several dozen being children. Within weeks, Israel invaded Gaza, starting with a massive bombing campaign followed by a ground invasion, and then a military occupation, beginning what Western media keeps calling a war between Israel and Palestine. Since then, Israel forces have officially killed over 70,000 people, most of them civilians, with an estimated 20,000 of them being children. I use the word officially here for a reason because these are the officially reported numbers by the people responsible for the killing. Other experts estimate the death toll is well over 100,000. For years now, literal years, mainstream media and our government have used the phrase, Israel has a right to defend itself.
Stand with the people of Israel in support of their sovereign right to defend themselves.
Israel has a right to defend itself.
Israel has a right to defend itself.
Israel has every right to defend itself.
We've been very clear about Israel's right to defend itself.
Israel has a right to defend itself.
Israel has a right to defend itself.
The United States recognizes Israel's absolute right to defend itself.
As a cover to white insane wash the destruction that Israel has caused in Palestine. However, to the rest of the world, it's clear that this is an act of genocide and collective punishment toward the Palestinian people. Since October 7, there have been clear, proven examples of ethnic cleansing, administering famine, human rights violations, systemic sexual violence, and so much more that can and should be being said about what's happening in Palestine since October 7, 2023. And there's even more to speak on about the violence, displacement, and racial subjugation that preceded October 7th in Palestine. All that said, it would be irresponsible of me as a non-historian and a non-expert on a very large and complex topic to attempt to explain this story that's well over 100 years in the making. But what I am pleased to do is bring in voices that are much better versed on this matter to help fill in some blanks. Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene are in some ways to the left of like mainstream Democrats, right? Which is a problem.
Yeah.
But if you know better, you recognize this is based in a white nationalist, Christian nationalist, fundamentally anti-Semitic.
I don't even like to say they're to the left because I'm not sure that it's a left-wing position they're taking on it. They're taking a coincidentally principled position on this, but it's not. It's not based on left-wing politics. They're not because they're not against imperialism. They're not against any of the things that make Israel's project functional.
Right.
They're fine with all those things. They just don't want it there for the reasons that they believe.
The perspective that I come from and the perspective that I adhere to is that I grew up my whole life. The only Jews I knew as a child were the Jews who wanted to expel me from my homes, the Jews who did expel me from my homes. I understood the Jewish people to be synonymous with Israel. And I found it admirable that despite all of this, despite them marching under a Jewish flag, despite them adorning their military garb with the Star of David, I found it so admirable that I was able to divorce Judaism from Zionism. And if anything, me and the rest of the Palestinian people need to be applauded for that, not cornered and interrogated further. Right? And that some Palestinian people feel animosity towards their occupiers is perfectly normal.
And for me, what I found was that a lot of people, a lot of YouTubers were just generally using Israeli and Zionist sources. And so when I took on the centrist for Palestine, I was like, this is not how you take on Palestine. You have to research the Palestinians. You have to focus on the Palestinians. You have to focus on the people who are actually being genocided and listen to their voices before you put in all these other sources from Israeli historians that you quote in as accurate and like 100% truth. Wherein academically, if you're thinking about it, who's more accurate of telling their own history? The Israeli historian or the Palestinian historian?
You know, here in this region that we live in, like we thought like everyone in the West is living a happy life, a comfortable life. Like everyone has an income, a nice house, a nice car, like everything they dream of. But like this reality is not real for everyone, like especially to PIPEC and indigenous people. So I have been talking about all of these topics, like whenever I see something that has, you know, like shared the struggle collective struggle, because like I believe we are all human beings and we all face the same problems and same issues, and this is something that deserves to be talking about. Because also, how come we want to be liberated here in Gaza and not ask for the same things for other communities around the world?
I do want to make one thing very clear about where I stand on this topic. I believe Israel is a settler colonial project backed by Western imperial powers, primarily the United States. And to me, Zionism is best described as a colonial framework that combines the characteristics of typical white supremacist structures with the added aspect of Jewish supremacy written into its laws that also launders its image abroad. This has resulted in an oppressive apartheid state that has been used to subjugate, murder, rape, and genocide Palestinian people, all with America's willful and eager support. And yes, this includes both your least favorite and favorite all-time presidents. I believe Palestine should be free, and in that I mean completely decolonized. And I believe Palestinians should be the individuals you look to decide what decolonization and liberation looks like. This was a video I began planning for and researching earlier this year because I kept seeing in my own personal real life circles, as well as in my comment sections and chats, that this idea that Israel is controlling America against its will, and that it was people like Candace Owens who were finally telling the truth about Israel, or that you had to hand it to them for being brave enough to speak against genocide and dead children and sending military aid to a genocidal state. And while there's complexity to how to properly criticize Owens and her ilk, and their correct but inaccurate criticism of Israel, I can summarize it with a phrase I'm going to repeat multiple times in this video. No, you do not, in fact, have to hand it to them. So what I'm going to try to do first is explain why you should reject Owens and her ilk and their what I call America First anti-Zionism. And then I'm going to try to provide a better baseline starting point for principled, functional anti-Zionism and critique of Israel, and more importantly, a pro-Palestinian stance in the critique of these issues. All that said, I'm going to repeat this as well. I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist. I'm an unofficial media expert, which is useful for some of what I have to say today, but not other parts of what I'm going to have to say. Thus, on a topic this complex and with so much history, it needs to be said that this, however long video, could not even qualify as a primer or baseline starting point on the issue as a whole. And I say this because I want to make sure that after people watch this, that they don't fucking quote me. There's certain things I want to be quoted on. I usually say it when I make the video, but I do not want people to mistake their affinity for me and my content for actual expertise on a subject that I just researched a bit to make sure I communicated effectively in one video. Look through the work cited on the page and make sure that what I said lines up with what's being said, and listen to the actual experts that I interviewed for this video. There are far more worthy figures in this battle to look to as thought leaders. I only hope to amplify them here while addressing a unique element of the topic that I do think I'm qualified to speak on, which is media manipulation and social cultural effects of such. And me saying that, hopefully you'll recognize, is a big distinction from what you might have heard from a Candace Owens, who swears that she has the truth about what's really happening and that somehow she'll share it with you for engagement and AdSense.
Big news. Exciting news. I believe we have at long last solved the mystery. Oh my gosh, Candace, what's going on? What's your take? The internet paying attention that there are these bizarre connections between everyone. Everyone's blind when it comes to Israel. And I say that on behalf of the world.
Within a short period of time after October 7th, Owens began to criticize Israel, something that got her in hot water with her then boss Ben Shapiro, a super Zionist, if you will. Mind you, Owens had always peddled in anti-Semitism, as many on the right tend to do.
First thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler.
But it wasn't until she began relentlessly criticizing Israel that any conflict erupted. This eventually led to her leaving the Daily Wire and going out on her own. You may be inclined to give Owens credit for this, but I'll explain later that you really shouldn't. Yes, Owens was punished for saying something critical on Israel, which is something that is fundamentally good in the grand scheme of things, but there's a big gap between Owens and other Black figures who have historically been scrutinized and vilified and punished for criticizing Israel. Owens is not one of those Black voices. White people have always tried to present her as such, but to Black people, Owens is a buffoon that rarely, if ever, has been taken seriously, especially regarding Black issues, because it's very obvious to us that Owens is not like us.
Finish this response. God is good.
God is good. Amen.
No.
No.
I thought you were going to say God is great. Thank you for the 48.
God is great.
No.
All right,
Y'all not going to give it answers?
I'm going to do you, Charlamagne.
Yes.
Charlamagne, God is good.
All the time.
And all the time?
God is good.
That's right. Where's that from?
But we do have to address her anti-Israel stance, her America First anti-Zionism, and recognize that it is important for Black people to see validity in the value of anti-Zionism. I want my audience, my core Black audience, to understand the necessity of advocating for Palestinian liberation. And I think a good place to start to recognize the difference in the insidiousness of Owens is how she talks about Hamas in this situation, comparing it to Black Lives Matter protests.
You know, during the times of Black Lives Matter, you might say, I don't support police brutality. Who does? But also, I think that police are a crucial part of every city. We need to have policing in cities. So these calls to defund the police are immoral and wrong and are going to lead to more Black deaths. Following George Floyd, there was no nuance. You had to explicitly say, defund the police. I'm seeing a lot of that behavior right now when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have seen every single person, including myself, condemn what happened on October 7th, who would not condemn innocent Israelis dying. But if you then say that it is also sad when an innocent Palestinian child dies, suddenly this is pro-Hamas, or you need to say, even when you're talking about how sad it is that a child dies, you need to button that statement by saying, but that child was a human shield.
Here, Owens says that she doesn't endorse Hamas the same way that she doesn't endorse defunding the police, presenting them both as common sense stances to take. In the same breath, saying she doesn't desire police brutality, nor does she want to see dead Palestinian children. From a normie and non-radical, non-critical perspective, who could argue with the way she's presenting this? No one wants to see police brutality. No one wants to see dead children. However, we have more than enough evidence, both historically and academically, to show that policing as it exists in America unchanged will never not lead to police brutality. It is woven into the DNA of America's concept of policing, which comes from slave cultures. I already made a video about it. I'll leave it in the description. But as for Hamas, well, I think it's sensible to say you don't desire for anyone to be killed on October 7th, especially young people at a concert. You also have to recognize that regardless of any rightful criticism of Hamas's tactics, they don't exist in a vacuum, nor did they magically appear on October 7th to launch that attack. Hamas was the last entity left actively fighting against the violent repression of Israel. And to me, that puts them more in the vein of Haitian rebels when they freed themselves from slavery, or the Mau Mau rebels of Kenya, or even Nat Turner's slave rebellion. All involve similar acts of violence, but not senseless violence. It's more accurate to say that that was decolonial violence in the name of liberation and decolonization. And decolonization tends to be a violent endeavor, no matter who does it or where it happens. And if you don't acknowledge the righteousness of anti-colonial violence, then it's similar to saying all lives matter when people say Black lives matter. And this is pretty consistent whenever the American right tries to address oppressed people in any meaningful way.
History would be like, you know, Palestinian nationalism is rooted in Nazism. It's anti-Semitic to want a Palestinian state that is for the Palestinian people. And I'd watch these videos, right? And I'd be going crazy, right? I'd be like, have any of you guys read Frantz Fanon? Like,
no.
Did the Algerians... Did the Algerians not have a right to resist their French occupiers? Did they not have the right to use violence against people who just massacred? If you watch or research Algerian French colonialism, there were days where they would massacre like 450,000 people in one day, right? And they'd like stack the bodies, stack the skulls, take the skulls to museums. Like it was violent. It was crazy violent. Right. And you look at that in the genocide of Palestine, in the occupation of Palestine, in the colonization of Palestine, and, you know, they'd be like, no, violence here against their colonizer is anti-Semitic because their colonizer is Jewish. And it's like, it's crazy. It's crazy when you watch those videos and they call it out for anti-Semitism, where it's like you have a colonizer who is Jewish and you have Palestinians who have to resist and attain liberation from their colonizer.
I bring up legends like the Mau Mau and Nat Turner because I want my core audience, my core Black audience that might be struggling to contend with what I'm saying, to understand the necessity of Palestinian liberation. And this is important because since and before the 2024 election, the plight of Palestinians has often been pitted against the plight of Black Americans in insidious and unproductive ways. After Kamala Harris lost the presidency, there was a social media backlash from many Black Americans against the pro-Palestinian movement that was really just was disappointing for me to watch. And I say that as a person that did hold my nose and vote for Kamala Harris. The presidential election was a legitimate no-win situation, so I could forgive the heightened emotions a lot of black folks had as we faced down a second Trump presidency. However, a year later, the same issues reemerged when Democratic darling Jasmine Crockett ran in the Senate primary against James Tallarico, and Crockett, who at the time had received no AIPAC money, still refused to budge on sending aid to Israel, knowing that this was a hard-line issue for a lot of her voters.
That supplemental package was for defensive help to Israel, as well as it was for money for Gaza, it was for money for Taiwan, it was also money for Haiti. And so, yes, I voted for it.
This eventually led to her losing to Tallarico, who wasn't that much better, but at least presented himself as amenable to refusing aid to Israel. However, in the aftermath of even that a year later, there's still this sense of bitterness amongst black liberals. What makes this race interesting is that it typifies a unique and insidious strategy from pro-Israel factions within the Democratic Party and the government to frontline black politicians as proponents for Israel, pitting black issues against the ongoing support of the genocide of Palestinians, as if we can't address both. Crockett, along with Hakeem Jeffries, Jim Clyburn, and Cory Booker, are all these black stars within the Democratic Party that have been trotted out to try to bait and switch black needs for Israeli support. And this is not a new phenomenon and ties to a long-standing tradition by Zionists to support social movements for others in exchange for being allowed to oppress people at home. Martin Luther King even seemingly sided with Israel and Zionism during his heyday, often repeating similar talking points that we hear today.
The whole world must see that Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
There's even an essay attributed to King titled A Letter to an Anti-Zionist Friend, published suspiciously a year after his death by the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, a prominent Israel think tank and lobby. And in this letter, King allegedly parrots the phrase, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. This so-called letter is widely considered fraudulent, and while King was nominally pro-Zionism before he died, it's highly unlikely that he'd have remained as such as Israel developed into the apartheid state that it would become. And even during King's time, despite the fact that he was being propagandized, he recognized the fissure at the core of Israel and the superpowers that enabled it to exist in the way it did. The following coming from a confirmed speech from the book, The Radical King.
SCLC and Dr. King have repeatedly stated that the Middle East problem embodies the related questions of security and development. Israel's right to exist as a state in security is incontestable. At the same time, the great powers have the obligation to recognize that the Arab world is in a state of imposed poverty and backwardness that must threaten peace and harmony. Until a concerted and democratic program of assistance is effected, tensions cannot be relieved. Neither Israel nor its neighbors can live in peace without an underlying base of economic and social development. At the heart of the problem are oil interests. As an American Jewish Congress has stated, American policies have been motivated in no small measure by the desire to protect the $2.5 billion stake which U.S. oil companies have invested in the area. Some Arab feudal rulers have no less concern for oil wealth and neglect the plight of their own peoples. The solution will have to be found in statesmanship by Israel and the progressive Arab forces, who in concert with the great powers recognize that fair and peaceful solutions are the concern of all humanity and must be found.
There is zero good faith analysis of King's work in history that could arrive at him remaining in favor of Zionism over the course of his life, had he lived long enough to witness Zionism's crimes against humanity. Historically, Jewish Americans and Black Americans have a complex relationship due to often sharing space in ghettos and urban environments. This has led to American Jews being stalwart allies to Black people in our times of need, but also outside of those times of need, being left in a prime position to exploit black people. The ADL is a perfect example of this, as they were key supporters of the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, but also engaged in direct targeting against more radical black leaders such as Malcolm X and King's one-time right-hand man Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture. Malcolm was an anti-Zionist from the beginning, and in particular began to lean much harder into leftist ideology after visiting the Middle East, which refined his critique against Israel.
Did the Zionists have the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all Arab property for themselves, just based on the religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago? Only 1,000 years ago, the Moors lived in Spain. Would this give the Moors of today the legal and moral right to invade the Iberian Peninsula, drive out its Spanish citizens, and then set up a new Moroccan nation where Spain used to be, as the European Zionists have done to our Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine? In short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's current occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. Where's their Messiah?
Malcolm died before he could continue down his leftward path. However, his influence on the black radical tradition influenced Kwame Ture and Huey P. Newton and other advocates that clearly saw alignment with Palestinian causes as necessary. And I bring this up not just because I think it's necessary to recognize the plight of Palestinians as being worth our attention and empathy, but also because it's clear then and now that our struggles are connected. Huey P. Newton explained this connection between various oppressed people across the world through the concept of internationalism.
We saw that it was not only beneficial for us to be revolutionary nationalists, but to express our solidarity with those friends who suffered many of the same kinds of pressures we suffered. Therefore, we changed our self-definitions. We said that we are not only revolutionary nationalists, that is, nationalists who want revolutionary changes in everything, including the economic system the oppressors inflict upon us, but we are also individuals deeply concerned with the other people of the world and their desires for revolution. In order to show this solidarity, we decided to call ourselves internationalists.
You know, I come out of the black radical tradition. I am a child or a student of Malcolm X. I'm a student of the Panthers. I'm a student of SNCC. And those traditions, yeah, they stood in solidarity with Palestine. But there was a deeper analysis and a deeper commitment, which was to internationalism. And so that black internationalist tradition that understood the relationship of us here to them there, whoever us and them is, was important. The need for solidarity, not just as a kind of ethical gesture, but as a political strategy and as part of an end goal, a political telos that said that we're not just going to replicate the nation building that Europe does, but we're going to try to world make. We're going to try and make something bigger and better and richer, more fair, more humane, more just, more democratic. That's the tradition that birthed me. And so for me, there was no way that I could be in this tradition and not be critical of what was happening in Palestine.
This sense of solidarity hasn't always been perfect or without consequences for black people. There have always been consequences, even in the micro. Believe it or not, I lost my first ever teaching job way back in 2007 because I implied that Israel was an apartheid state while teaching an English class. All I did was show videos that were readily available in our school library. One video was a promotional video for tourism in Israel. One was a video looking at the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. Neither of them were all that aggressive. And I barely knew enough about the subject to give any significant analysis. I just asked my students to compare and contrast two presentations of the same state, and they naturally were able to identify injustice without any further coaching, which is what made me a good teacher. I asked them to use common sense, but along with critical thinking. And not long after that, I was literally called to the principal's office and convinced to find a new job the following school year. Ironically, the principal, after telling me that I was going to be given a clean release, he still put a negative report on my teaching certificate that eventually derailed my entire teaching career, which ultimately brings me to YouTube. So shout out to Principal, you racist, lying piece of shit. You helped make this possible. Fuck you.
And so finally, when I gave a speech at the United Nations at the International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian people, the next day I got a phone call from CNN telling me that I was fired. They said my speech did not align with their values. When I asked what I said or what they did, they just kept saying, we can't tell you, but it didn't align with our values, which is true.
Accurate.
They wasn't lying, right? We ain't had the same values, but it did more than just cost me a job. I almost got fired from my job at Temple University, even though I was tenured. They censured me. The board of trustees said that I had committed the worst moral transgression he'd ever seen. Damn. He was Bill Cosby's personal attorney, by the way. You can't write this shit, dog. And I was banned from universities for years, and I'm able to speak at universities now. Right. But it's not about the money, but I lost millions of dollars.
Yeah.
My career's never been the same. I'm still in TV jail.
Yeah. All that said, it feels like the days of Black people or anyone being persecuted for having a stance against Israel or against Zionism, the days of Lupe Fiasco derailing his career for criticizing the Bomber of Gaza, those are long gone. If Lupe wanted to return to that political position today, he'd be mostly celebrated. For the longest time, no one has been safe to critique Israel or Zionism, no matter who they are, Black or otherwise. However, the live streaming of this genocide has altered this reality. People are being confronted with the reality of what the Zionist project is and has always been. Images of dead children, the tons of rubble that used to be a city, the evidence and accusations of systemic sexual assault, the barbaric and violent rhetoric being used by Israeli citizens and leaders alike, the killing of journalists in broad daylight, and so much more. It's inevitable that cognitive dissonance would set in, and the end result of nearly 3 years of human atrocity streamed directly into people's computers and cell phones has completely altered the American opinion on Israel. In fact, I think it's safe to say in 2026 that being anti-Israel is a popular position to hold. And this is despite the fact that our mainstream media and politicians have been lying to our face about the reality of what's happening in Gaza, asking us not to believe what we're seeing with our own two eyes. The incongruence of our media's message with the reality we can see has left most Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, confused and looking for answers. So in the absence of a logical explanation for what we're seeing, many Americans have resorted to seeking the wisdom of the only true honest voices left in the equation. Bro podcasters.
I feel like this Twitter, internet, drama, war, all this stuff is never going to end. People are literally dying.
Fact checking's fun.
Yeah, I know. We're gonna check a lot of things.
And people are like, I can't believe they're doing it after the market closed. Listen, he's intentional, he's strategic.
If you have a political opinion about the conflict and you post it, boy, you are opening yourself up to a world of chaos and fighting.
Like, obviously, if you're Israeli or you're Jewish, you're locked in your passion. If you're Palestinian, you're locked in your passion. But those of us who aren't either, I think what we've been going through is just like, what the fuck is true?
I remember when Theo Von first said something sympathetic about what was happening in Israel toward Palestine. And initially I was excited because Von is one of the largest figures in alternative media, one of the most influential people in American media right now, as ridiculous as that sounds.
There's a conflict that's been happening in the Middle East. People know about it, between Israel and Palestine and some of the areas over there, the Gaza area they talk about. It feels to me like it's a genocide that's happening. Sometimes I feel like I should say something. I'm not a geologist or geographer or anything like that, so I don't know. Some of it I do know though. For me, it's just like how I feel like you see all these photos of people, just children, women, people, body parts, just people like putting their kids back together. And I just can't believe that we're watching that and that more isn't said about it.
This eventually also spread to his peers such as Joe Rogan and Andrew Scholes, to the point where we now have Shane Gillis making jokes about it at the Kevin Hart roast at the expense of Chelsea Handler.
Chelsea is a Zionist. Speaking of dead kids, she's a big fan of abortions. Chelsea's been scraped more times than the grill at Benihana.
And Shane, just so you know, Judaism and Zionism are two different things. Kind of like how Chinatown and Koreatown are two different things, but your favorite slur works in both places.
I don't know, it's weird, and it's like the best we got, which is really fucking awful. With the media failing to be real about what's happening, you go to YouTube, and on YouTube, unless you're stuck in the left tube bubble, when you start researching what's going on in Israel, you get a ton of anti-Israel media from right-wing channels or quasi-right-wing channels, many of them with huge platforms and large viewerships. The brosphere, if you will, has clearly turned against Israel, as have many of the aforementioned far-right political figures like Owens and her peers. And just by the sheer level of their reach and influence, it's undeniable to say that they are responsible for the popular shift in view of Israel that began happening in 2025. The current data on this shift is undeniable, as many surveys have shown that Americans are far more critical of Israel and Zionism than they've ever been. And before going any further, I want to acknowledge that this is fundamentally good for Palestinians, regardless of the other ramifications that it might have on Western politics.
For one, we understand that the Christian right is Israel's biggest base, right? In terms of supporters, in terms of money, in terms of this is the biggest electoral bloc. So if we are looking away from the ethical and the political issues with the rise of this anti-Israel right, strategically speaking, it's great because it is really Israel's biggest voting bloc in this country. And so, for example, the Israeli military can desecrate every mosque there is every day of the week, and they wouldn't need to address it on the global stage. Recently, the second there's a video of Israeli settlers spitting on Christian tourists or spitting on a church, the second there's a video of Israeli military raiding a church, you see Benjamin Netanyahu himself addressing the Christian nation, reassuring them that Israel is a beacon of light and democracy and love for all people, especially Christians, because they understand that they are losing footing with the biggest voter base that they have. And I think that is important, right? And that is good. But that does not mean that there's a wholesale embrace or partnership or coalition to be created with the anti-Israel right, because it's not the anti-Israel feelings that are being created are not necessarily, and this I don't want to generalize obviously, but my sense is that they're not necessarily centered around values and principles that are pro-Palestinian or anti-racist. Rather, they are chauvinistic in a lot of ways. They are nationalist in a lot of ways. This is about maintaining U.S. independence, maintaining U.S. domination. It's about maintaining Christian domination in a lot of ways. And that is problematic, and that cannot be glossed over. Mm-hmm. However, when it rains, you have to take a raincoat.
I said earlier that being anti-Israel is now a popular position to hold, but I think it's more accurate and telling to say that it's a populist position. But populism, while a useful and powerful political tool, tends to have no conscience and probably can be more easily used by the least scrupulous of political figures than by those with actual good principles. Populism is why Bernie Sanders, for example, for better or worse,
often more worse than people like to admit, but I ain't gonna fight with y'all about that today.
He was able to reanimate the American left in the mainstream in 2016. But that same type of populism also got Donald Trump elected in 2016 and in 2024. Anything from saying Black Lives Matter to anti-vaxxing can use populism, and this paradox brings us back to Candace Owens. As I mentioned in the last section, Candace Owens left the Daily Wire, which at the time was seemingly flying pretty high as an independent network backed by millions in conservative think tank dollars. But things started to change over the course of the latter part of 2023 as Israel began its public genocide and ethnic cleansing. Recognize that Americans opposed the genocide almost from the beginning. It was never all that unpopular of position, but the greater shift to being legitimately anti-Israeli across the board in America hadn't fully set in yet. But many on the right, especially those of Christian nationalist inclinations such as Owens, immediately recognized this as an opportunity to mainstream certain ideologies as well as build brands and maybe even political power. Owens, along with other far-right figures such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Nick Fuentes, and Tucker Carlson, over the course of the last 18 plus months began to openly and loudly be critical of Israel, as well as break away from the MAGA movement they had once been extremely loyal to. For Candace in particular, this created a conflict with her boss, Ben Shapiro, who was about as pro-Zionist as a public figure can be even now. Despite the fact that Owens has always been anti-Semitic, as is typical of many on the far right, he was fine with her as long as she didn't criticize Israel. This is typical of Zionists, by the way. They recognize that ultimately their most valued allies are amongst the American far right, even though that group is far more likely to genuinely be anti-Semitic, and many of their beliefs essentially believe that they need to be the ones genocided in order for Jesus to come back, or some other weird evangelical fundamentalist stuff that I don't know anything about. That said, once Owen began criticizing Israel publicly and harshly, she was quickly fired.
So yeah, when I found out really kind of sort of definitely with the rest of the world that my show had been rather unceremoniously canceled, it was upsetting.
Owens immediately did a short promotional tour and then went independent, and unmoored by any semblance of oversight or anyone telling her what to do, she began to publicly criticize Israel even more, as well as continue to peddle in her own brand of unhinged right-wing conspiracy theories, from purporting that a foreign president's wife was secretly a man.
You can try to split hairs in how you feel and how you've always felt like a woman. What I'm saying is that you were born a man and you will die a man.
To her current and still ongoing feud with Erica Kirk, the widow of her, I guess, best friend, Charlie Kirk.
And yes, there's been immediate backlash. And yes, I am already being blamed for the immediate backlash because it's always somebody else's fault when it comes to Erica Kirk, okay?
I don't know. You know what? I'm not even going to do that right now. I'm not even going to go in there. As you listen to the ridiculous things she's saying, you might scoff, but understand that since going independent, she went from around 1 million subscribers with the Daily Wire to over 6 million in just the last 2 years. And her far-right peers have seen similar success and crossover appeal. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson both managed to make entry into more moderate and centrist spaces, rebranding themselves as populists looking out for regular people, despite the fact that both come from innately anti-Semitic and white supremacist backgrounds. Tucker is the most shifty and grifted crypto-fascist in media history, only letting his mask slip a bit when he brings up stuff like the Great Replacement Theory.
The Great Replacement Theory, yeah, a theory. It's the realest thing there is.
Which is the belief that Jews are seeking to dilute the white race through race mixing and immigration. Green was a QAnon supporter and gave us the meme of Jewish space lasers and believes in blood libel.
A very interesting new technology where they were harnessing the sun's...
Who's they?
This company.
Jews.
No.
I'm joking. God. But somehow they found themselves on The View, being interviewed by the New York Times and gaining popularity with the non-MAGA crowd. You may or may not have an aunt or uncle that is a moderate or even a liberal that says,
you know what? I think Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson might be good for America.
And that is a problem. Fuentes, thankfully, because of Fuentes' stuff, is still being stress tested on the right to see if there's a possibility to pull him more into a more establishment position. They want to harness his unique appeal to chronically online and irony poison Gen Z males who would walk into a volcano if he asked them to. And this has found him in friendly conversation with the likes of Tucker Carlson, although other figures have been less amenable to his presence. Regardless of this, though, he's definitely grown and been empowered by critiquing Israel the way he has.
And this is something that crops up over and over, is this double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to Israel. And I called this out, and I would criticize Ben Shapiro very harshly. And I said, why is it that Israel gets all this foreign aid? They're the #1 recipient for 50 years. I think Ben Shapiro is Israel first.
The mainstreaming of these figures is a complex challenge to progressive politics, anti-Zionism, and Palestinian liberation, as it has a twisted web of virtues, allegiances, and threats that, if not understood correctly, would allow for progressive voices to ultimately empower right-wing and fascist entities. And if you ask me, the American right is hijacking anti-Zionism for nefarious reasons, and we need to be able to understand and do something about it.
For the first time, being critical of Israel, I won't go so far as say anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, but to be critical or have an unfavorable opinion of Israel is the dominant position among Democratic voters. That is a huge shift. We haven't seen that with Republicans yet, but it's growing. Since October 7th, we've seen so much violence. We've seen a full-fledged genocide. It's hard to be surprised that people are moving in that direction, especially when Republicans have been so brazen in their defense of the most unprincipled actions and unprincipled positions of Israel. I mean, when you have people saying there are no innocent people in Gaza, that there are no innocent Palestinians, when you have people saying they're going to bomb Gazans into the next generation or destroy generations to come, and when you have the United States funding it, again, it's not surprising that voters, everyday people, anyone who reads or watches television is going to say there's something wrong here. That has created an opening for an entirely new conversation. For decades, supporting Israel was a position that was so taken for granted that it wasn't even debated on a Democratic stage. I mean, if you were to go to the Republican convention or the Democratic convention every 4 years when the presidency is being competed for, and you were to hear their statements on Israel, they're saying the same AIPAC statements. When you watch Donald Trump go against Hillary Clinton, they were mortal enemies. They were ideologically at odds at every turn, except when Hillary Clinton starts saying, well, the Gazans had a chance for paradise, they chose Hamas. She went down the talking point list that AIPAC provides. We saw that there was no divide because there was no room for a divide. I think the biggest reason was because there was no information. Yeah. The information wasn't out there and there was no space to have the conversation. And because politicians didn't have space to even be a little bit critical. I mean, Bernie Sanders, who is a Jew, when he says, look, if they violate human rights, laws, and rules, then we shouldn't give them money. People went nuts. They were even calling him a self-hating Jew or an anti-Semite.
The mildest criticism from him.
Right. I mean, Jimmy Carter said, if we keep going in this direction, Israel will become apartheid. He didn't call Israel an apartheid state as much as we wish he had, and he got blasted for it. Yeah. So there was just no room for it. But after October 7th, the disproportionate response, the death of children, the bombing of schools, all of this changed the game. And it opened up space, but it didn't just open up space for a radical politics or for a more progressive vision of what the Middle East could look like. It also opened up space for grifters. Yeah. It also opened up space for anti-Semites. It also opened up space for people who had no interest in seeing a free Palestine or justice in the land. They just wanted to enact their evangelical views about what the last days would look like. They just wanted to reinforce their hatred of Jews or have a kind of democratic or liberal backing for it. These are people who had their own political agendas who are now smuggling in a very hateful politics under the banner of a Free Palestine movement.
Yes, despite what the weirdest leftists on Twitter might say, keyword there, on Twitter, we do still have to talk about anti-Semitism as it pertains to Palestinian liberation, but not for the reasons that one might imagine. A lot of times when we talk about anti-Semitism and the genocide in Gaza, the underlying goal is to disarm would-be critics who want to group Judaism and anti-Semitism together and say that an attack on Zionism is an attack on Judaism. And I'm just going to keep it a buck. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that. Aside from the fact that I feel like others have already made it abundantly clear as possible that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism, it just gets to a point where we need to stop acknowledging these bad faith criticisms and giving them so much time and energy. Nothing is going to stop certain people from calling me an anti-Semite. It is what it is. The folly of even framing it like this is also the main topic of Muhammad El-Kur's essay, Jewish Settlers Stole My House, It's Not My Fault That They Are Jewish, which is included in his book of essays that everyone should read, titled Perfect Victims. In this essay and throughout Muhammad El-Kur's book, he refocuses the conversation of what's happening in Palestine on the actual victims in the equation, the Palestinians. Specifically, he presents that requiring Palestinians to be perfect victims in order for their oppression and resistance to be taken seriously fundamentally implies that somehow that oppression is warranted.
My view on anti-Semitism is that it's not my fault and it's not my responsibility, and it's really not like at the top of the list of my priorities. I understand and I see since I was a child that the Israeli regime really monopolized Judaism in favor of its ethnic cleansing program, its favor of its genocidal project, and it has made itself synonymous with Judaism. Zionism has made itself synonymous with Judaism. And in the aftermath of that, Palestinian people and the allies of the Palestinian people are forced into a corner, made to explain themselves and explain ourselves away from the accusation of anti-Semitism. But I feel as though that is not the focal point. It is not the focal point of my struggle. It is not the focal point from a material perspective. Because if we are looking at things materially and systematically, we would see that anti-Palestinian racism and quite literally the annihilation of the Palestinian people is written in the law, is written into policy and procedure, and it is systematic, whether in the US, whether in the UK, whether in Germany, and certainly within Israeli government. Whereas anti-Semitism is not something that festers or exists today in the United States on a systemic level. And there's an outsized attention that gets put on the issue of anti-Semitism. And this is, by the way, not because the people who hyper-focus on anti-Semitism are really concerned about the Jewish people. It is used as a tactic for distraction. It is meant to be a distraction from the focal point of the mistreatment of the Palestinian people, of the genocide that is waged against the Palestinian people. Because the same people who cry anti-Semitism at every chance they get have no issue shaking hands and forming alliances with notorious anti-Semites, like Pastor John Hagee from Christians United for Israel, who said that Hitler was a hunter sent to hunt the Jews.
Then God sent a hunter. A hunter is someone who comes with a gun and he forces you. Hitler was a hunter. And the Bible says, Jeremiah writing, they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill out of the holes of the rocks, meaning there's no place to hide. Because God says, my top priority for the Jewish people is to get them to come back to the land of Israel.
You know, and this is not just Netanyahu and the Likud government, the right-wing government, creating alliances with anti-Semites. In his foundational text on Zionism, Theodor Herzl, one of the founding fathers of Zionism, said that the anti-Semitic states will be our greatest allies. And the way they have operated throughout history has been throughout teaming up with anti-Semitic states, anti-Semitic actors, while maligning the Palestinian people as anti-Semites.
All of South Lebanon was under Israeli occupation. You couldn't go south. You would be kidnapped by the IDF, you'd be killed by the IOF, and it was suffocating. Even right now in Lebanon, it's suffocating. People in Lebanon, like the people in Palestine, fought and they liberated the lands of the south. And for a lot of people, that's scary. But for me, I don't care if you're scared. You know, I don't care if you're feeling scared. You know, I don't care if you're feeling like Jewish settlers deserve to be safe in peace and in comfort and in security and having all this surveillance apparatus around. And this might seem harsh and radical and crazy to hear, but I don't care, right? I care about the 78 years of brutal occupation, of just mass, endless killing that Palestinians have endured. And you could look at me straight in the face right now, not you, FD, but anyone who supports Israel and and defends Israel and say, no, Israel has a right to exist. And I look into your face and straight up tell you that it doesn't. No settler colonial state, be it Canada, America, Australia, French occupied Algeria, and Israel, has a right to exist. The people of that land, the indigenous peoples, the Palestinians, the indigenous peoples of America and Canada, have a right of sovereignty over that land. I can't go right now. I can't go to Rome I can't go to Russia. Right? I have a bit of Russian ancestry in me, and go into this random mountain region and be like, this land has belonged to me 3,000 years ago. This house that you're standing in is my house. This was my ancestor's house. You gotta get out. You gotta leave. Anybody who saw me doing that would resist.
Genuine anti-Zionists and, more importantly, Palestinian voices for liberation should not have to couch their criticism of their oppressor in a language that first checks off several boxes to ensure there's no anti-Semitism involved before levying their criticisms. This is something that I felt innately as a Black American observing from a distance, because this same innately white supremacist tactic has been used to stifle the voices of oppressed Black, African, and other people of color in the face of colonial terror for generations. For an example of this, when George Floyd was murdered, it was Candace Owens herself that made a 20-some-odd minute long video focusing on the idea that George Floyd was no angel, as if this legitimized his murder at the hands of police officers.
Nobody thinks that he should have died during this arrest, but what I find despicable to be is that everyone is pretending that this man lived a heroic lifestyle when he didn't. And I want to talk about what his lifestyle was and why I refuse to accept the narrative that this person is a martyr or should be lifted up in the Black community.
To even acknowledge this type of framing is backwards, in my opinion. The state is not allowed to murder Black people for any reason, and Zionists should not be allowed to set up an apartheid state in the name of their religion. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The irony is the people who should be doing the most work to prove they're not anti-Semites are the same people who have usually been responsible for harm toward Jewish people throughout history, traditional white supremacists like Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and yes, Candace Owens. I hope I don't have to explain that Candace Owens is a white supremacist. Like, I know for some white people that confuses you, but it shouldn't at this point. And I don't have time to even do that in this video. Just trust me, okay? Candace Owens is a white supremacist. And the irony is that Candace Owens will call herself a Christian nationalist, Nick Fuentes calls himself a Christian nationalist, etc., because they say, well, it's not anything about race. It's just, I believe in Christian values and want a nation that is also Christian. But this guy also called himself a Christian nationalist. So you kind of see what's going on here. And this is a really important point I need to drive home as we talk about anti-Semitism. What I'm going to show in a moment is that Owens and her ilk are relying on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes that are most prominent amongst overt fascists and neo-Nazis. And I've had numerous alleged progressives, leftists, allies, and even some friends, all of them white, attempt to downplay the danger of normalizing ideas and language and aesthetics that come from neo-Nazis. I had one peer refer to it as a Zoomer meme, and we may have had an argument about that a little bit. The argument that I've seen for this is that Jews targeted by this type of rhetoric have numerous significant layers of protection that render it mostly a non-issue, that there is no systemic oppression of Jews, and thus the alleged threat of normalizing neo-Nazi behavior and talking points is akin to when a white person complains about reverse racism. And overall, I see where they're coming from with that, and I mostly agree with that analysis. But you know who is actually commonly targeted by neo-Nazis and affected by systemic oppression? Fucking black people. Also Muslims, immigrants, queer people, and pretty much every other affinity group you could think of that isn't white or white passing. So when I see the casual uses of white supremacist neo-Nazi rhetoric being used, whether it's as a joke or unironically by so-called leftists, I see that as an open threat to me. No shade to Jews. But I'm not thinking about y'all when I have that issue. I'm thinking about the fact that neo-Nazis and white supremacists are not some defunct group with no access to structural or institutional power. They are actively in our government and openly recruiting. And even if it were just a few Zoomers memeing on Reddit or 4chan every 6 months or so, one of those folks will eventually meme in real life and people die. Usually black people, recently Muslims, often immigrants, almost never the white people that don't seem to think that it's a big deal. I know I'm only talking to a small group with this point, but I fear it does need to be said that language and words are signifiers. I did the thing. They mean things. They take up space, or in this case, make more space accessible for the wrong types of people. And it's not lost on me that for nearly a decade now, a big initiative of the online left has been rehabilitating ex-neo-Nazis and right-wingers, which I've always taken issue with. So of course, many of them will resort back to old habits as soon as they get the opportunity to. But then to have the temerities complain that they're being tone police because they're being rightfully critiqued for their lack of principles and discipline. There's another white leftist rant in there, but I'm all out of those. I'm all out of those. Just understand, policing of an anti-Semitic tropes and ideology hasn't for a while been explicitly about protecting Jewish people. And I do understand the insidiousness of how that might be received while Israel is committing a genocide in the name of Judaism. But that's not what I'm doing here. What I'm doing here is fighting the normalization of Nazi, fascist, and right-wing ideology that threatens everyone, especially the most vulnerable of us. Surely that's not a bad thing. So yeah, despite what the 4chan left would like to say, we have to talk about anti-Semitism because it is at the core of the right-wing critique against Zionism that we must defeat. And we cannot address the problems of America First anti-Zionism without disarming it of its most useful tool. We have to differentiate between principled anti-Zionist stances and the America First version. And that comes down to how Israel, Zionism, and Judaism are all critiqued very differently when you compare what Candace Owens and her ilk are saying versus what Muhammad El-Kurd and Mark Lamahil and other principled anti-Zionists who are leftists are saying.
There's plenty of room for a left-wing and a right-wing critique of Israel's role in the region. There's plenty of room for a Democrat and Republican criticism of this, right? We could say from the left that we're anti-imperialist. We could look at the political economy of it. There's lots of stuff we could say and do. There are people on the right who could just say, hey, we should be minding our own business, right? We're isolationists. There's lots of reasons to say, I don't want to be a part of what's going on over there as an American citizen, as an American voter, as an American taxpayer. The problem with the Nick Fuentes of the world, and the Tucker Carlsons of the world, and the Candace Owenses of the world is not that they have a criticism of Israel. And sometimes, as my grandmama would say, they will hit a straight lick with a crooked stick. They will say Israel's wrong, and this is a moral atrocity. And I think particularly Candace Owens has been right about that. I agree with her 1000%. Candace is right. What's going on to innocent Palestinian children is wrong. What's going on, the bombing of schools is wrong. The idea that there are no innocent people is wrong. The idea that there's a disproportionate response by Israel, all these things are wrong. And some of them are even commanded by their faith to say that. Cool. The problem is the circles that they travel in, the language that they use, the discourses that they traffic in, they smuggle in anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish cabals of power. They smuggle in this idea that the United States is participating in the support of Israel, not because of its own geopolitical interests, which are clear, but because of some Jewish conspiracy to bring down the United States or to blackmail or control the United States through some behind the scenes backdoor secret deal.
Illuminati stuff.
The Illuminati stuff. All these things which are unfounded. The problem with the Candace Owens of the world is they say the right things in terms of the criticism of Israel, but they often sneak in some other stuff, or they stand next to the guy
that sneaks in the other stuff.
Who sneaks in the other stuff. And so they seem complicit by association. And all of that is deeply, deeply dangerous, because you don't want to be at the Free Palestine rally with folk who end up starting that next chant.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Because that next chant, you ain't gonna like.
Yeah, you're not a part of that next chant.
And you ain't part of that one.
Yeah. Blood and soil.
Exactly.
What Owens and her peers do is simply point out the easy to understand horrors of Zionism, something that liberals and so-called progressives could do if they weren't so beholden to liberal Zionism and both sizing the frameworks of this issue. But the problem is that Owens and the right also don't bother to interrogate or situate the reality of Zionism and Israel within the greater context of Western geopolitics. They completely ignore America's obvious history of enthusiastic support of the abuse of Palestinians well before October 7th and so on. None of the really important parts of the topic ever come up from the right. Instead, they quickly pivot to extremely effective tropes pulled from American media about Jewish conspiracy theories. You may not realize this, especially if you're one of my viewers who is not American, but a lot of tropes around evil and secretive powers in the shadows that exist in Western art and literature and film are references to long-standing anti-Semitic tropes. Remember how I said earlier to think about that appeal to common sense? Well, this is an example of how that can be easily weaponized for nefarious means. Throughout history, Jews have been mistreated by society, especially in Europe under Christianity. The reason why the concept of Zionism resonates for Jewish people is because it's based around the idea of a Jewish homeland from which they wouldn't be able to be expelled after centuries of mistreatment from various nations around the world. As such, tons of stereotypes and folktales were developed around Jewish people that are baked into things we don't even think twice about today. Everything from witches and their pointy hats and big noses to the bankers in Harry Potter, even some depictions of vampires and goblins and other supernatural creatures refer to persistent anti-Semitic tropes of the clandestine, mystical, and secretive evil of Jews. Probably the most impactful example of this comes from the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a hoax fake book that was created in Russia in like the early 1900s, and it still is taken seriously by a lot of people to this day. And from this book, we get all this stuff about secret societies and plots and the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Jesuits, the Babylonians, or whatever the hell Professor Jiang was talking about in that one interview. When you hear globalists and secret cabals, etc., they're talking about Jewish people. And these concepts are so saturated into everything from hip hop to Saturday morning cartoons that we don't really think about where their origin point came from.
Suppose there's no harm in walking you through our plan for world domination. We did work hard on it. It all starts here with the banks.
The Jewish part has been pulled out, but the framework still remains the same. And it's actually the disconnecting of the Jewish aspect to these old conspiracy theories and tropes that makes it more insidious, because the trope itself still remains relevant and valid in the mind of the viewer or the reader or the consumer of that media. And then when Candace Owens or Professor Jiang reconnects the Jewish part to the story, it's still extremely compelling. Storytelling is a powerful way to relay messages and create culture, and a good story that connects to people's implicit biases can be extremely convincing. That's how we got QAnon a few years ago, which was also driven by conspiracy theories and cabals of Jews doing rituals with children to kill them and drink their blood for adrenochrome to make them immortal, dark magic, witchcraft, secret societies, all the shit that you know is there. And if you go back and you listen to the way QAnon people talk to each other, the way they wove together these stories, you understand that this was their own form of storytelling and narrative building that was built around these theories.
Why are we not talking about all the kids that are going missing? Why? That makes me question you.
Well, what we're saying is crazy is the Satanists who are hurting children. Pizza is a code word for child pornography. Cheese pizza, child pornography.
How did they get to that position of power?
This may seem silly, and sometimes it is, but the fact is that for so many people, their political analysis boils down to it's the Jews. I know part of this is just because I've been around a lot of hoteps and NOI people over the course of my life, but I know I'm not alone when I say that some people think they're really cooking when they say,
you know what it is? It's the Jews.
And aside from that being genuinely anti-Semitic, it's also just frustrating because it shows the limitations of people's ability to analyze social problems beyond the bullshit they've been given from our media. And Candace Owens and her ilk know that there's a lot of people in America that are very confident in that misinterpretation of our social issues. The American right is not interested in a critical assessment of the nature of Zionism because its only goal in anti-Zionism is a forwarding of an America First agenda. And to do so, it must focus on a framing of Zionism, not as the typical European colonial project that it is, but as this unique thing only explainable through Jewish conspiracy theories. And even with the level of grooming and popularity that It's the Jews has had historically in America, it still probably wouldn't have been as effective and widespread as it is right now had it not been for probably the most significant event in the history of conspiracy theories happening in the last 6 to 18 months, the release of the Epstein files. From my perspective, the release of the Epstein files probably marks the point where America First anti-Zionism becomes a truly popular stance, in part because it manages to validate America's cultural love for conspiracy theories, and it allows Americans to maintain the fiction that America is virtuous and only requires the removal of rogue evil agents to put it back on its rightful path. I'm not going to explain Jeffrey Epstein in explicit detail, but here's a quick rundown for those of you who may have somehow missed it. Epstein was a pedophile, pimp, sex trafficker to the rich and famous. He allegedly used a combination of social engineering, charisma, and blackmail to work his way into the highest echelons of society, having hung with everyone from Bill Clinton to Michael Jackson at some point, along with one of his clearly very best friends, Donald Trump. Epstein managed to become extremely powerful and well-connected. However, at some point, his crimes managed to catch up with him, and he ends up getting investigated by the feds. This leads to his first arrest in 2009, for which he is given an oddly short prison sentence, but he is again arrested in 2019, and at this point, he miraculously manages to commit suicide while in custody under very mysterious conditions, which has the end result of closing his case permanently, despite the fact that there seemed to be a lot going on with this man and a lot of powerful people that helped him get to where he was. And it was found that there were allegedly millions of files collected about his criminal enterprise that were being held under some type of official seal, and these would become unofficially known as the Epstein files. The Epstein files became a holy grail for conspiracy theories, as it was believed that they would prove the existence of the deep state, which is again, protocols, elders design type shit, and numerous major conspiracies such as QAnon allege the Epstein connection. Trump plays into promising to release these files, despite the fact that he is clearly all over the files.
It's just very strange for a lot of people that the list of clients that went to the island has not been made public. So if you're able to, you'll be...
Yeah, I'd certainly take a look at it. But yeah, I'd be inclined to do the Epstein. I'd have no problem with it.
And when he gets elected, he quickly changes his tune for that very reason. And while the MAGA movement is a cult, the lure of saving children and defeating the deep state was the key ingredient for many within that cult. And there's a limit to how much a lot of them will allow themselves to be lied to. Some, like the late Charlie Kirk, went along with the program and told people to drink the Kool-Aid and shut the fuck up.
I'm done talking about Epstein for the time being. I'm going to trust my friends in the administration. I'm going to trust my friends in the government to do what needs to be done, solve it, balls in their hands.
Balls in their hands.
Candace, on the other hand, immediately started to lean into those conspiracies and what those files must have been hiding, which of course had to be the secret plans of the Jews.
Epstein's living there. Maxwell's are living there in Israel. It's getting pretty interesting. It's getting pretty spicy.
Due to some work in the House and the Senate, the files are finally released, but only half of them, and they are heavily redacted. However, what was released was more than enough to validate conspiracy-minded folks across the country. There were some big names exposed, such as Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and Elon Musk. People tracked 1,000 mentions of the word pizza, considered by the Pizzagate conspiracy theorists as a code word for children used for these evil rituals. There's also at least 50 uses of the word cannibal or cannibalism. And there's at least one anonymous interview for a person who alleges that Epstein was a Mossad agent, along with a whole bunch of other nonsense, which is important to think about because pretty much anyone could call up an FBI tip line and say the things that are being reported in these files. And I think this is an important detail to keep in mind because I think most of the files are bullshit. I'm sorry. I think that the idea that these people were secretly running the world but didn't know how to encrypt their own emails should be enough to tell you how seriously to take most of the stuff that's in these files. But the end result, regardless of how I feel, supercharged conspiracies of cabals and elites working to control the world from the shadows, tracking of online extremist activity from hate groups and neo-Nazis spiked as the files were released because the files had a whole lot of Jewish kind of everything in there. And Owen began to weaponize that stuff pretty much immediately, using her immense talent for crafting conspiracy theories to bring Jewish conspiracies back to the forefront of her anti-Israel stances. My disbelief does not matter. I'm not the target audience here. When people have been theorizing about this stuff for decades and it's been in our media for even longer, it makes sense that conspiracy theorists would see these files as a smoking gun. Look out for people talking about this stuff in the comments. I know it's coming. And when you combine this specious evidence for conspiracy theories with the fact that our government and our media is directly lying to us, people will come to the conclusion that makes the most sense to them. It's the Jews. And I need people to understand that this isn't philo-Semitism. This is me trying to explain that it's the Jews is a horrible analysis of any material problem facing actually oppressed people in the equation. And that's what bothers me the most. The wanton spreading of bad ideas and the frontlining of the worst possible analysis that we could have if we're trying to work for a free Palestine. A lot of regular people who don't know any better don't see that Epstein and his crimes are not some type of secret cabal, but is how capitalists have always functioned under capitalism. The Epstein files point to the decadence of the bourgeois class as it's been described by leftist theorists for well over 100 years now. But that's not as enticing and convincing as the idea that you could get some type of secret knowledge of adrenochrome by listening to Candace Owens rant for an hour and a half. A conspiracy theory is a great story that can center you as a hero, and a material analysis of American imperialism and capitalism mostly just forces you to recognize that you're not a hero, you're actually a part of the problem for upholding and buying into these systems in the first place, and most people don't want to do that. So it's the Jews. Candace Owens knows that most people aren't interested in a revolutionary critique of capitalism or American imperialism, but the idea that she can guide them into a world of secret knowledge, that there's some special info that she has that will explain everything, that is far more convincing. And the numbers show this, and not just for Candace, but so many alternative media creators, many of whom are barely holding that their criticism is based on conspiracy theories. The combination of innate anti-Semitism in our media and the cipher of the Epstein files has calcified into the mainstream criticism of the state of Israel. Not anti-colonial theory, not anti-imperial theory, not any type of leftist theory, the Articles of the Protocols of Zion. So now Israel isn't a Jewish supremacist state because of its racism against Arabs. It's a Jewish supremacist state in the same way that it's described in the Turner Diaries, and we cannot let that stand.
I don't like the tendency to just criticize the anti-Israeli right without actually looking at the facts of why they have been so insanely popular. And I think the biggest reason is that they talk about things a lot more simply than we do. Mm-hmm. You have people like AOC and Zohran Mamdani and all of these, progressive and pro-Palestine Democrats give you like 10,000 disclaimers before they even tell you that they're anti-genocide or that they feel that Palestinians deserve rights. They have to apologize for decades and decades of anti-Semitism before they even get to the point. And they talk about the issue with such complex language, and they try to hold a million truths at once, and they lose us as Palestinians and pro-Palestinians, and they lose the Zionists, and they win over nobody. They cater to a demographic that does not exist. Meanwhile, the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, for all of her faults, she can speak about this matter with such clarity. She says, I am against killing children. Of course, two paragraphs down, she's talking about Mexicans in such a horrific way. But for the first few lines, she's talking about it with such clarity. And I think it is about time that we learn from them a matter of simplicity, because we are so concerned with data and being scholarly and being academic academic that we lose the listener. Most people care about right and wrong, care about good and evil, and the right has perfected this like simplistic and reductive way of thinking about things. And we must understand that not everybody we're addressing at all times is somebody who's a scholar and academic. Sometimes we're talking to like, you know, a woman in Alabama who's working 2 jobs and she only is interested in Palestine, Israel from like this 5-minute window she has when she's scrolling on TikTok. I want to give her the right sentiment to champion. I don't want to like give her a history lesson all the time, because people have enough things going on in their lives. But I think we look down upon some of the propaganda tactics of the right. But of course they're problematic, but they're effective.
Candace Owens and her peers are only able to muddy the waters on Palestinian liberation efforts because the so-called progressive figures of America have refused to take a principled stance against Israel. The reason for this is obvious and most easily exemplified by this old clip of the former Democratic president, Joe Biden, way back in 1986.
I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
This brings us to an important point and really the whole reason why I decided to make this video. Something that conflicts with the narrative Owens and the right have been running with for almost a year now. The United States is not being controlled by Israel. In fact, it is deeply invested in Israel for its own self-interest, not due to some form of blackmail or coercion or a deep devotion to Jewish Americans or regret for the Holocaust or some secret cabal of Jewish elites or anything fantastical like that. And if there's one thing I need some, not all, but some of you to understand, it's this idea. The idea that Israel is somehow controlling America is a lie. Israel is a vassal state for the United States, not the other way around. Israel serves America's interests in that region, and that is the main reason why we are their ally and vice versa. They act as our guard and attack dog in the Middle East, much as Malcolm X stated earlier.
I say, imagine our circumstance in the world were there no Israel. How many battleships would there be? How many troops would be stationed?
Israel helps alleviate the cost of American imperialism. Instead of keeping our troops and ships and guns over there, we just give Israel the money and weapons to handle things for us. When nations like Iraq or Syria start nuclear programs that might threaten American imperial power, we can have Israel handle that without getting our hands dirty. Even apart from the Middle East, if America has use for a goon to get their hands dirty for our imperial needs, Israel is there, such as when the IDF helped train and supervise militaries in South America under the orders of Ronald Reagan, which helped to put down left-wing movements in Nicaragua in the 80s and also set the stage for the CIA to smuggle crack into Black communities. I want to note, however, that even this explanation of Israel serves American interests still isn't quite enough to explain what's happening. A great book for those of you who want to understand the problems of Israel and the influence of Zionism on America that will hopefully disabuse you of more conspiracy theory nonsense is called The Israel Lobby, written by John Mearsheimer. And I like this book for 2 reasons. One, because it's pretty simple and straightforward as a text. It's not written in that flowery academic language that is hard for regular people, including me, to follow or keep interested in. But more specifically, this is not written by some radical leftist or even someone that is right-wing. The author Mearsheimer seems to be a moderate, if not centrist liberal, like, let's be real, probably a nice amount of you watching. So he's not even engaging in a real critical analysis of the thing from a leftist standpoint. He's just speaking to the problem from a good for America political strategy standpoint. Early in the text, Mearsheimer actually goes to great length to point out that even the argument that Israel is such a useful tool to help control the Middle East is not fully logical, pointing out that Israel is, for one, not always the best ally because they're often more self-motivated than we like, and 2, they're not as quick to throw hands in the Middle East as we feel like they should be. Citing that Israel was not able to help at all during the Persian Gulf War because of their genocidal nature. And he even points out that Israel is sometimes just bad at being a spy for us, providing inaccurate and useless intel to the United States about what's happening in the region.
In fact, Israeli assistance was sometimes of dubious value. One former CIA official reports being appalled at the lack of quality of the Israeli political intelligence on the Arab world. Their tactical military intelligence was first rate, but they didn't know their enemy. I saw this political intelligence and it was lousy, laughably bad. It was gossip stuff mostly. Israel also provided the United States with faulty or misleading intelligence on several occasions, probably in order to encourage the United States to take actions that Israel wanted.
Ironically, at the same time, this hasn't kept them from spying on us, their alleged ally, an issue that has been happening for decades and is happening right now, as the dubious allyship of Israel has pushed us further and further from what many typical Americans would feel is a good position in the Middle East. Mearsheimer argues, in fact, that America's backing of Israel for all these years has been at the expense of stability in the Middle East, as Israel is just too rabid of a dog in the area to allow for what would likely be, at least for America, more productive deals between us and Middle East nation. Believe it or not, there was a time where the Middle East had a mostly favorable image of America, or at least a neutral image. But when we became the main backer for Israel terror in the region, that led to intense anti-American sentiment that is maintained for decades now, and Mearsheimer argues that this did not have to be the case.
As a justification for helping Israel, in fact, this particular strategic argument is essentially circular. Israel is portrayed as a vital ally for dealing with its dangerous neighbors, but the commitment to Israel is an important reason why the United States sees these states as threats in the first place. Indeed, Washington might find it easier to address the various conflicts that it does have with these states were its policies not constrained by prior commitment to Israel. In any case, these states are at present too weak to harm the United States significantly, though they can certainly make life much more difficult for certain U.S. actions, most notably in Iraq, and Israel has not been much of an asset when America has been forced to take steps against them.
Now, you might be thinking,
well, this is proof
of there being some type of deeper, more clandestine conspiracy to explain Israel's control over America and the fact that we continue to support them despite it not being in our best interest. But even Mearsheimer rejects this premise outright, instead pointing to what should be obvious if not for the love of Jewish conspiracy theories and cabals.
The Israel lobby is the antithesis to a cabal or conspiracy. It operates out in the open and proudly advertises its own clout. In its basic operations, the Israel lobby is no different from interest groups like the farm lobby, steel and textile workers, and a host of ethnic lobbies, although the groups and individuals who comprise the Israel lobby are in an unusually favorable position to influence U.S. foreign policy. What sets it apart, in short, is its extraordinary effectiveness.
So basically what's happening is that from the right and the far right, you're getting a very Nazi Jewish supremacist kind of definition. And people are buying into it. They're buying into it because some people are naturally anti-Israel and they actually believe they're for Palestinian liberation. But that kind of definition of Jewish supremacy differs from the Palestinians in the 1960s and the 1970s who initially came up with the term of Jewish supremacy, right? And the difference is that first one, the white supremacist one that's being thrown around right now by Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuente, and
Marjorie Taylor Greene,
Candace Owens, all those types. It's rooted in that Nazi kind of definition, right? It's rooted in the Nazi kind of way of Jewish supremacy and the idea that, Zionism rules America, which is being debunked and falsified by Palestinians since the 1950s. Like since the 1960s, when they're dissecting Zionism and American imperialism, they were ripping into this idea that Jews control the world, that Jews control America, and that this is all on Jewish people, that we should be resisting Jewish people only. And so when you look at the definition of Jewish supremacy from Palestinians in the 1960s and the 70s, they tie it historically to the ground. And this is kind of what Faiz Sayyih, Nur Musalla, Ghassan Kanafani, and even like a Jewish American in the 1970s, Hyman Loomer, write about. This is what they discuss in great detail. So that's the difference of it when you're looking at it. There's historical root and ground evidence of this versus you have, Tucker Carlson coming in and being like, Jews control America. We have to...
The protocols of the elders of Zion type shit.
World imperialism has its interests that it fights fiercely to defend and keep. These interests consist in robbing the riches of the underdeveloped countries by purchasing them at the lowest prices and then processing these riches and reselling them at the highest prices in the markets of these same countries. By this operation, they accumulate immense profits, enabling them to increase their capital at the expense of the people's poverty, deprivation, and wretchedness. The Arab world possesses many resources, mainly petroleum, and constitutes a big consuming market for manufactured goods. Imperialism wants to maintain this situation to allow the process of accumulation of imperialist wealth to continue, on the one hand, and our poverty to increase on the other. To this end, it is genuinely determined to crush any revolutionary movement that aims at freeing our country and people from this exploitation. The revolutionary movement of the masses in the Arab world naturally aims at destroying Israel, because Israel is a force that has usurped a portion of this world and is a great danger threatening other portions of it. Consequently, Israel cannot but fight to the end any Palestinian or Arab revolutionary movement. Here, imperialism finds itself in the best position in this part of the world because through Israel, it is able to fight the Arab revolutionary movement, which aims at eliminating it from our homeland, with Israel becoming the force and the base used by imperialism to protect its presence and defend its interests in our land. Such a Sit 34 strategy for the liberation of Palestine creates an organic unity between Israel and the Zionist movement on the one hand, and world imperialism on the other.
Even the current very unpopular war in Iran is not purely a situation where Israel has coerced America into a war that we didn't want. It's important to note that we low-key didn't, and every American president up until Trump was more disciplined to manage Israel's violent nature when it came to that area. This is also why Netanyahu greatly supported Trump to begin with during the election, but Israel manipulating an incompetent president into decisions that a competent president wouldn't have made is not the same as them controlling the situation, because the bottom line is every president for well over a generation has sought to disempower and attack Iran in some form or fashion. They're just better at imperialism than Donald Trump is. Donald Trump low-key has been really bad for American imperialism. Like, how do I say this without people getting mad at me? People like to point to lobbies like AIPAC as proof that Israel is truly in control, buying off our politicians and our government and flooding money into people's pockets to control them to support Israel no matter what. And understand, AIPAC is an incredibly powerful political lobby that manages to be bipartisan and funds candidates on both sides of the aisle. But this is less proof of secretive control of the government from the shadows and more proof of just the corruptness that our government has existed in for really generations, but definitely since the 2010s when Citizens United made it possible for super PACs like AIPAC to donate money in the first place. Further, AIPAC is not an explicitly Jewish-funded lobby. Plenty of its money is corporate money with a variety of backgrounds, and more significantly, while AIPAC is a powerful Israel lobby, it pales in comparison to the Christian Zionist organizations in terms of power and funds and influencing our government. In an article from Mother Jones, writer Kiera Butler speaks on the massive influence of Christian Zionist organizations, pointing out that one Christian Zionist group brought in over $270 million in the last few years, which is more than AIPAC and the ADL made combined.
Those groups primarily target Jewish donors for their fundraising, but according to the spokesperson for Eckstein's organization, 92% of the donors are Christians. Since 1983, when Eckstein's father, a rabbi, founded the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, the group says it has raised a staggering $3.6 billion for Israel and to support the Jewish peoples more generally. Since the death of Eckstein's father in 2019, the group has more than doubled its revenue.
Another aspect that undermines this idea that AIPAC is behind everything is that two of AIPAC's biggest critics on the left have still not presented a strong anti-Zionist position. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, aka AOC, both reject AIPAC money and are openly critical of AIPAC and have been for years, and advocate for other Democrats to not work with the powerful PAC. Yet both have at best taken liberal Zionist stances against Israel, both sizing the issue as if it's not very clearly a genocide going on. Bernie Sanders still to this day kind of refuses to call it a genocide.
People are talking about what constitutes genocide, all that stuff. Fine. Frankly, what we should be talking about is how we stop this damn war. Do you have an International Court of Justice which is defining what genocide means? What we can agree on, I certainly see, is a mass slaughter of women and children, which is unacceptable, which has got to end. And as a United States Senator, I am leading the effort in the Congress to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't get the money he needs to continue that. If people think that's not good enough or they want to argue about this word or that word, fine.
Without making another video, but definitely posting some things in the description, liberal Zionism is an attempt to both sides the issue of Zionism. Liberal Zionists will acknowledge that Israel is doing harm, but refuse to acknowledge the full extent or nature of that harm or legitimize Palestinian resistance to it. They will say things like Israel has the right to defend itself without acknowledging how it exists and what it's defending itself from. Israel can only exist as a colonial project that hinges on apartheid, racism, and genocide, and its right to defend itself is essentially the right for it to maintain apartheid, structural racism, and genocide and not be attacked for people trying to free themselves from that oppression. Liberal Zionism is insidious because it presents itself as a reasonable or rational response to the obvious human atrocities happening in Gaza. It acknowledges the suffering and decries it, but positions itself as the only realistic or rational extent of addressing that suffering. It cloaks itself in phrases like
ongoing negotiations or two-state solution
and speaks to its intentions to fix the problem, but the reality is anything short of decolonization and giving back land to Palestinians leaves them in a state of colonization. It blames Palestinians for not wanting a peaceful resolution without acknowledging that the Palestinians are living in an ongoing state of violent occupation. Essentially, it puts the Palestinians on the same playing field as their oppressors while consistently disregarding the humanity of Palestinians in the process. This now famous clip of Mossab Abu Toha shows the folly of this fake empathy that both sides the genocide.
Your win is not without controversy, obviously, and in particular, some comments you've made in the past about the Israeli hostages. Mm-hmm. I believe you specifically singled out Emily Damari, who's a 28-year-old who was kidnapped from her home and held for 471 days. I'm just wondering, is there anything you want to clarify about those comments?
First of all, I did not question her status as a hostage because she's a hostage, but because what other Palestinians who were kidnapped. I mean, I don't want to name people, but I have people in my family who were kidnapped from checkpoints, from schools, from shelters, and they are named prisoners. I was questioning, why should we humanize this soldier? And she was a soldier, and other hostages be named hostages while my loved ones should be named prisoners. I was kept hostage for 53 hours. I was blindfolded and handcuffed and was beaten in my face and asked for the Israeli soldiers to see a doctor, and they denied me any medical treatment. So no one is talking about this. Why? I questioned why are they given this privilege of being called a hostage? While in all news platforms, I was detained. I was a prisoner. Why? Am I less human than anyone else?
Just to drive this home, Mossab is a civilian. He's not a soldier or insurgent or revolutionary. He is displaced in his own home. But the woman in question he's being asked about is a soldier, is in willful and active combat against him and his state. And he's treated as a soldier when he's not, and she's treated as a civilian when she's not. Liberal Zionism weaponizes Mossab's very existence as a present threat to Israel, to Zionism, and our media, our politicians for decades have endorsed this framing, which is why so many people have struggled to empathize with Palestinians along with the typical Islamophobia that America has also embedded in it. As Muhammad El-Kurd speaks to in his work, this requirement for Palestinians to be docile, unthreatening, and completely in accordance with Western aesthetics, the hyper-focused on women and children as if the man can't also be victims of this violence, all of it works to maintain a framing of this conflict that evades the reality of what's really happening.
The reason why I wrote my book was because I think a lot of the books written about Palestine, be it by Palestinians and otherwise, and most of the time it's written by other non-Palestinians, are really data and fact-driven, and they're statistic-driven, and like you're kind of honing in a point. For the past 7 to 8 years, you're just driving home a point that it seems you're trying to persuade an audience into something. And what I've realized is that this is not really a matter of persuasion. There's something way bigger than facts and statistics here, because there is tribalism at the heart of this. There is racism at the heart of this. And the way people were consuming this, even the pro-Palestinian people, was deeply problematic, because for you to be in solidarity with the Palestinian subject, you must first kind of defang and disarm the Palestinian subject. You want to create the Palestinian Palestinian man in your own image in order to feel a kinship towards them. And another thing we do is that we overemphasize women and children. One, we are robbing the women and children of their agency because they have been active participants in the Palestinian struggle throughout history. But two, it's the assumption that Palestinian men are meant to die, and it's a quite for to die. It's also the assumption that all Palestinian men are fighters. It's also the assumption that the viewer, again, is racist, and so the viewer cannot stomach to sit face to face with a Palestinian man, and so I must present this docile, doe-eyed, beautiful girl for them to listen to. So instead of challenging the racism at hand, we are just assuaging it, accommodating the racism, thinking that we're going to change the world by just accommodating racism, and that is deeply problematic. And there's other things that I talked about in the book, but those were the driving forces, because I think we have been stuck in, open any book about Palestine from the 60s, from the 80s, from the 90s, you would see the same persuasive tactics on, and we've been stuck in a loop. And I want people to kind of snap out of it and think about this more critically. This conversation should be driven not just by like facts and statistics, it should be driven by logic first and foremost. And what happens is that we are trapped in an illogical hallucination.
This racist imperial framework is something that Israel is doing and has done for around 100 years and will continue to do of its own free will, even if America stopped helping it out. I don't want to infantilize Israel's intentions aside from America's imperial interests. Israel was Zionist before America was invested in it as a project. Israel has its own goals for the region. It has its own nuclear arsenal. And according to recent reports, they're definitely spying on us to a level that we are starting to get uncomfortable with. If we imagine America as like a crime boss, then Israel is the goon that we employed because we appreciated their bloodthirsty style. And now they're getting to a point where we can no longer control them. But that doesn't make us innocent in that equation, especially considering that it was us that put them in that position in the first place. America's investment in Israel is due to a mutually beneficial and reciprocal relationship that many on the right refuse to acknowledge because it clashes with their ideological framework, their America First framework. Because to acknowledge America's investment in human atrocity in Palestine, they'd also have to acknowledge the same thing happening at home and abroad. For the right, America can do no wrong, so surely it must be Israel at the head of the problem. But no, these are two hearts beating to the same drum. Zionists do not control our government, our politicians do. And Zionists do not control our politicians either, our capitalists do. And some of our capitalists are Zionists and some of our government officials are Zionists, but that's because capitalism and fascism and imperialism are all marching to the beat of the same drummer. Not because of Jewish conspiracy theories.
I had to convince my brother, I had to sit my brother down and talk to him about who Tucker Carlson is, about who Nick Venta is, about who Charlie Kirk is. Because, he'd watch his videos on Instagram and TikTok and they're so absorbable and believable that you would come out of it and be believing that Jews control America. And it's like, no, even in the 1970s, they were talking about American imperialism. They were talking about who gives Israel the arms and the weapons and the technology. There's like a double-edged sword with this, right? On one hand, you could 100% blame it on American imperialism, but then you look at Israel and you cannot deny that Zionism itself, that Jewish people themselves are colonizing and killing Palestinians. You cannot take the blame away from Jewish people in Palestine who are colonizing it continuously today and ethnically cleansing people in the West Bank and Gaza and even southern Lebanon. The expansionist state of it is committed by Jewish people. You cannot deny that. But at the same time, the people who fund it, who give it the arms, who give it the weapons, are Americans, are Europeans. And so there's this kind of, and it's easy for people to look at American imperialism and blame it all on American imperialism and kind of deny Palestinians the voice that I used to live in this house for 100 years. And one day a Jewish person from Brooklyn came into my house, ripped all my stuff out of the house and said, this house now belongs to me because, this land was promised to me 3,000 years ago or whatever shit,
Right. Much like in the Jim Crow South, Palestinians are subject to unspeakable violence that they cannot get legal recourse for. Any involvement with the legal system of Israel is basically a kangaroo court that categorically sides against them. Their movement is restricted, often requiring badges and passes that limit all opportunities for work and travel, similar to apartheid in South Africa. And this is all before getting to the constant threat of violence and the actual violence that they are subjected to. This is not to imply, as others might tell you I'm trying to do, that Jewish supremacy isn't a thing and isn't real, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think the absence of acknowledging and recognizing how Zionists, like all Western imperial and colonial projects, is white supremacist in its nature, more easily allows for this America First Zionism to flourish. Owens and her peers operate on the belief that Jews are not white, which is just not reality in any non-racist or non-white supremacist context. It's no big secret that the Zionist project was born from and for Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe, and Israel, as previously mentioned, has been a tool to bolster global white supremacy and imperial projects worldwide. So it's quite convenient that this aspect of Zionism is often left out of the analysis of so many Western, i.e. white leftists. But if you try a bit, you can see that Palestinians clearly illustrate the connection to European imperial projects. For example, take this excerpt from Noor Masalah's The Palestinian Nakba.
Although Zionism was a latecomer to the European Romantic national tradition, the invention of the Jewish people and construction of a new collective consciousness in the 19th century, a tradition recast with historical depth and ancient roots, was in line with other Eastern and Central European national projects of the age. These Zionist historians reinvented a new Jewish historiography which was not only divorced from Jewish collective memory, but also at odds with it. Political Zionism was in fact a radical break from 2,000 years of Jewish tradition and rabbinical Judaism. Zionist nationalism, a latecomer among the national movements of Eastern and Central Europe, looked for historical roots and sought to reinterpret distant pasts in the light of newly invented European nationalist ideologies. According to American Jewish historian and theoretician of nationalism Hans Kohn, Zionist nationalism had nothing to do with Jewish traditions. It was in many ways opposed to them. Zionist nationalism adopted German Völkisch theory. People of common descent should seek separation and form one common state.
Another Palestinian scholar, Arij Sabah Khoury, draws a similar comparison, noting that identifying the origins and nature of Zionism within greater European settler colonialism is not meant to flatten it, but to better understand it.
Like some other settler colonial projects, the United States, South Africa, Algeria, the Zionist movement has always emphasized its exceptionalism, and this is reflected in the production of academic knowledge about its history. However, comparison is a vital element of my analysis, not to argue for absolute equation of Zionism or the state of Israel with other settler colonial histories, but to trace pattern ways of doing and thinking, and its relationship to other cases termed settler colonial. Using settler colonialism does not refute Jewish religious and historical connections to what they term Eretz Yisrael. Rather, it is a diagnostic analytic category that describes dynamic encounters between settlers and natives and the processes through which territorial and demographic orders have been transformed to favor Zionist settlers at the expense of indigenous Palestinians, becoming routinized as structures through which settlers are prioritized over the indigenous, often in ways that further entrench denial of indigenous sovereignty. I gotta learn how to speak Hebrew for an empty signifier video now. I'm crying.
All that said, as we center frameworks brought forth by people in the region, people affected directly in this conflict, it is important to recognize that Jewish supremacy is probably a more important topic for other people, specifically those of us in the West, to understand, because we're inundated with Zionist propaganda that we need to unlearn and be more critical of, especially for the efforts of combating the insidious ways in which Zionism, and more specifically liberal Zionism, has embedded itself in Western thought. For most of you watching, the term Jewish supremacy probably brings up images of this guy again, and the conspiracy theories from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and this book, etc. And that's understandable and expected, in part because if you're watching this on BreadTube, talking about anti-Semitism and debunking Nazis is what most of us have been doing for the last 6 or 7 years. So it makes sense that cognitive dissonance and immediate rejection of the concept might be your immediate reflex. And on top of this, Zionists in Israel have worked very hard to reduce all criticism of their project historically to these same images of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazis. However, that is not what Palestinian and Arab scholars and revolutionaries are talking about when they speak of Jewish supremacy. And call me a weirdo, but I think it's important to not lazily conflate the two in public discourse for reasons I mentioned earlier. To Palestinians, Jewish supremacy is based on how Judaism is written into Israeli law to produce the same results that apartheid South Africa saw with their settler colonial project, or the original formula for this framework, the Jim Crow South in America.
Herein lies an important difference between Zionist racism and other forms of European racism familiar since the advent of colonialism to the peoples of Asia and Africa. Race supremacist European settlers elsewhere in Asia and Africa have, by and large, found it possible to express their supremacy over the other strands of lesser people and inferior races within the framework of hierarchical racial coexistence. Separate and unequal, the European colonists and the natives have on the whole coexisted in the same colony and protectorate. Though they have openly disdained the natives, ruthlessly suppressed them, and methodically discriminated against them, European colonists have, as a rule, deemed the continued presence of the indigenous populations useful for the colonists themselves.
And as such, they reserved for the native all the menial functions and assigned to them inferior in the settler-dominated society. Not so the Zionists. Race supremacist Zionist settlers in Palestine have found it necessary to follow a different course. More in harmony with their ideological system, they've expressed their fancied supremacy over Arab natives. First, by isolating themselves from the Arabs in Palestine, and later on, by evicting the Arabs from their homeland.
And this is all before getting to the constant threat of violence and the actual violence that they are subjected to. This is what they mean by Jewish supremacy. And while it mimics and draws clearly from the ways that white supremacy has always functioned and worked within European imperialistic projects, it is important to recognize that religious distinction. Zionists insidiously use Judaism to shield against these obvious supremacist tactics and differentiate themselves from the more oblivious evils of apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow in the American South. Ironically, while much of the Zionist project happened with the goal of attaining whiteness for Jewish Europeans, Zionism has also purposely weaponized the non-white status of Jews as a way to deflect from their very white framework of governing. When Palestinians speak of Jewish supremacy, it's them recognizing how traditional white supremacy influences Zionist behavior, but it also recognizes the uniquely insidious nature of Zionism as a religious manifestation for racism and apartheid. Yes, I am aware that Jews of other races still exist in Israel and enjoy a status above Arabs, but this is typical for all white supremacist projects and frameworks. There have always been people othered by the dominant social structure under white supremacy that decide to align with it, even if it means relegated themselves to permanent second-class citizen status. Candace Owens herself, again, a black white supremacist, is a perfect example of this, along with pretty much all black Republicans.
Because even though Israel is now majority Mizraim, there's still Ashkenazi supremacy within the Israeli culture, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's leadership, all these things. There are very legitimate reasons to say that Israel is still based on a certain kind of white supremacist project. And other people have written about this, where in Europe, they couldn't be white.
Right. They can be white in Israel, though.
They can be white in Israel. They can be white in Israel. And so you then see the racialization of the Palestinian. You see the Palestinians become other. They become the racialized other, who are subjected to all of the kinds of things that happen inside of any racial state project. And that's what you see happening there. And that's what makes all of this very fascinating, because the racialization isn't about phenotype. Because the Ethiopian Jew, the Beta Israel, they're part of that state, the Israeli state. The Afro-Palestinian who lives in East Jerusalem is on the other side of the equation, even though phenotypically they may be more similar. So the racialization isn't about phenotype. That's not to say that there aren't examples of anti-blackness that exist everywhere that are about phenotype. But in terms of the racial, is the primary thing, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's language, the thing that subjects you to premature death in Israel is being Palestinian. I think that's just important to note.
There's more to be said about the racist and white supremacist nature of Israel and Zionists and the overrepresentation of Ashkenazi, aka white Jews, in comparison to Jews of other ethnicities, the reports of forced birth control and sterilization of Ethiopian Jews. There's even an emergence of an explicit white supremacist faction within modern Zionism. But from the Palestinian standpoint, there is also a necessity in illustrating how Judaism is utilized to justify their oppressed state. It's a process of exclusion, expulsion, and extermination of Arabs from their homeland, as opposed to the usual subjugation and exploitation that was seen by enslaved Black people and Africans. What needs to be understood is that Palestinians critique Jewish people in Israel not because they are Jewish, but because Israel forces Judaism into the role of a repressive institution. Israel and Zionists use Judaism the same way that white supremacists use whiteness, and they expect you not to point that out when you're critiquing the problem. It's outright comedic to genuinely accuse people whose houses are being stolen of being racist against the people stealing their houses with support from the government and our government and from Jewish people outside of Israel. It's not the Palestinians' fault that their oppressors are Jewish. It's important to reject this framing because it necessitates a critical engagement with Jewish identity outside of Israel as well. If you acknowledge Israel as a supremacist ethno-religious state, then it calls into question any and all support of that state, no matter what your background is. Jewish settlers who steal land from Palestinians are often imported from America, and this happens with little or no consideration of the awfulness of what they're doing. Recently, the mayor of New York, the purported anti-Zionist Zohran Mamdani, came under fire from the left for arguing that protests happening at a synagogue in New York were anti-Semitic based solely off the fact that the protest was at a place of worship. The problem is the synagogues in question were holding events to promote illegal purchases of land in Palestine that would eventually displace Palestinians from their homes. Do you think these protests were happening because these people hated Jewish people and were anti-Semitic, or did they have an issue with the illegal practices that they were promoting and facilitating at the synagogue?
My take on Mamdani is spicy. You know, I say in my video on surveillance that he is the archetypical good Muslim. Ooh. You know, the kind of guy who stands up for Palestine, who backs Palestine, who has a father who is in anti-colonial studies, who is very much for Palestine and against Israel, who is very much anti-Zionist. And then you have Mamdani coming in, and yeah, it boosts the Muslim perception of a mayor in America. Like that's fabulous. That's amazing. But at the same time, it's like you're going around denouncing Palestinians who voted for you, who voted you in, and you won't even see the wrong. And this is a bit spicy, but you don't see the wrong of selling Palestinian land in Israel. Like right. there's a deep wrong of these colonial auctions of land. And then you come up on stage and you say, you know, that's anti-Semitic. You should not be protesting selling land in Palestine.
Did he say that?
He did. He said he denounced it. He condemned it. And for me, I was like, you're right now, and it's spicy and it's kind of hot.
That's not very spicy. That's pretty cut and dry, in my opinion.
For me, it's like you're being the good Muslim here. You're basically folding for the NYPD in your cabinet. You're giving them all the authority to go after Palestinian protesters. You're basically clamping down on the movement.
In my heart, I don't believe most Jews would openly support such activity if not for the false image of Israel as a Jewish state acting upon a divine right, propagandizing itself as a bastion of liberty that is just holding off the horde of Arabic barbarians who only want to tear down this project. Zionism has had the effect of blinding everyone to their crimes, and for many Jewish people, the symbolic concept of Israel is worth defending and protecting until having had to witness the reality of what Zionism is for the last couple of years. And we are seeing that over the last few years, statistically, amongst younger Jews, they are less likely to have a positive view of Israel or Zionism compared to their older counterparts. The ADL and other Zionist entities have reported that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism worldwide. And while many progressives reject this as not being real, I think doing that actually looks at this the wrong way. Instead of saying this is outright false, I think we should just acknowledge that people are witnessing the violence of Zionism in Israel as their soldiers kill kids and journalists while wearing the Star of David, and this is leading to misdirected animosity toward regular Jewish people. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, by the way, but I feel the way it's often framed by proponents of Israel is dishonest and dangerous. The reality is any rise in anti-Semitism that is happening is not the fault of Palestinians or anti-Zionists. It's the fault of Zionists themselves, alleging that their violent, barbaric practices are in the name of Judaism. It's only natural that regular people witnessing that happen might ask questions and sadly might act in irrational ways. but it's Zionists and Zionism that maintains the narrative that their actions represent all Jewish people, and this is incredibly harmful toward all Jewish people and needs to be stopped. Anti-Zionism is not responsible for a rise in anti-Semitism. Zionism is. Instead of the constant refrain that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, the opposite is actually true. Zionism is anti-Semitism. The last thing I want to address is, again, the role of media, both mainstream and alternative, and how we've commodified and distorted Palestinian liberation struggles for what I see is for the sake of market extraction, money, and clout. And even those of us who consider themselves anti-Zionist or truly seeking Palestinian liberation can fall into this trap of overemphasizing our role as people not directly engaged in the struggle in Palestinian liberation to deleterious effects. And while this isn't exactly the same as what Candace, Owens, and her ilk are doing, it's not quite not the same either. Much consternation has been made around what YouTubers are or are not making good videos about Palestine and the genocide, and who said enough, and who's really got good takes on Palestine. And regardless of how you feel about the qualities and intentions of different people's videos, one thing is true almost categorically across the board. Very little on this topic is actually being made by people from that region or even sourcing Palestinian or scholars from the MENA region in their content, which is one of the reasons why there has been some bad content made on this topic. Now, I have not made consuming videos about Palestine part of my regular media diet, so it's possible that I'm just not aware of the landscape fully. But as far as I can tell, only 2 creators with any direct connection to the MENA region have been able to make significant content about the genocide. And that's Dr. Fatima, who is from Libya, and Lost Futures, who is Lebanese. One Dime is also Lebanese, and he did tell me in the middle of a heated debate about this video that he was getting ready to release his own video on the topic, and that may come out before this comes out. If it did, here it is right here. Cheap plug, the shit is good. Shout out to One Dime. But as far as I can tell, that's it. Also, like, One Dime is still white. One Dime, you still white. Now, I don't want this to be interpreted as a DI representational politics thing, as if being Palestinian or from that region automatically gives you the best opinions and ideas about Palestinian liberation. Just as Candace Owens exists as a black white supremacist who actively fights against black liberation, there are Palestinians and people from the region who serve the same purpose. And this was a topic from one of Lost Futures' videos currently titled Arabs for Genocide. But recognize as I say that inflammatory title that I and most of your favorite creators and influencers who have made content on the topic could not have made that same video. In part because for Lost Futures, this is a real area of expertise and interest and personal connection, and not just something he's doing because it's trending or because his fan base desires it from him. There's a lot of reasons to side-eye the lack of attention that his Palestine videos have gotten versus his videos on, say, Attack on Titan. But to me, it's more indicative of what people are really watching us for. And it's not what most of you say you're watching us for.
For me, my main priority for making YouTube was education foremost. And yeah, I get it. You know, I get the entire thing of like getting subs and getting reach and getting views and whatnot to expand the educational kind of point. But whenever I make a video, there were some easy targets for me to hit early. You know, I could have gone on that Attack on Titan train and milked it dry for a good 2 years, right? But like right when I published Attack on Titan Part 2, October 7th happened. Like right when I was finishing that video. And after that, I was like, do I chase this Attack on Titan, you know, hype that my channel is getting, or do I focus on Palestine? You know, that was a choice for me. At that moment, after all that research I did for Dr. Fatima, I was like, there's no way I can't make a video on Palestine right now. Like, I gotta do this. I don't care about the Attack on Titan hype train. I don't care about the thousands of comments that I got on that video that, you know, accelerated it into the stratosphere. My focus right now is on Palestine. And it was a tough decision, you know, because it basically, like, you know, it went to like, I don't know, 50K viewers. And then all of a sudden I published Palestine and I hit like, I don't know, maybe like 5,000 first week. And I was depressed as fuck. I was like, oh crap, I made the biggest mistake of my life. But at the end of the day, I was like, this is more important than talking about Attack on Titan, talking about anime. You know, as for people not reaching out to me, it insulted me. You know, I did feel hurt when I started seeing the videos rolling around at that time, and all they're citing and all they're bringing onto their videos are Jewish people or people aligned with the Palestinian Authority, which is like this very colonized Palestinian perspective that denounces Hamas, it denounces resistance to the occupier, that wants to, coexist with the occupier as they're being occupied in the West Bank. Like, it's crazy. You bring people on like that onto your channel, and I'm like, I'm right here. I got a video on Palestine that's over an hour. I have all this research. And, it was insulting, but at the same time, I was like, how do I go further? The backlash to that, like my reaction to not being invited, to not being able to speak on that, and to not even being shared. Like, people would watch my video on Palestine. They would be like, okay, good for you, man. I'm not going to share this around. So I made a part 2 where I was like, okay, it's been like 2 months since October 7th. I've seen your videos, guys. I've watched all your videos, and they're liberal Zionist slop at best. Like, I'm sorry, they were really bad, and I was like, hey, let's touch on all the Zionisms, from political Zionism when it originated to liberal Zionism today. Let's talk about it all. Let's really get into the nuance here, quote unquote nuance of how people talk about it, of Zionism and how it's being talked about right now.
The thing that makes us different from Owens, though, is the intention and basis of what we create, of our analysis. But the thing that makes us similar at the end of the day is that we still have some of that same blindness and cynicism in how we engage on this topic. There's an incentivized drive in the way these platforms are designed for people to position themselves as leaders on the topic, but not actually engage with what leadership contributes to. Many creators want to be a voice for Palestine, or their fans want them to be a voice for Palestine, without considering that Palestinians already have their own voices. So it makes me question what people are really pursuing here. And to me, this is best exemplified by the rise in prominence of one Norm Finkelstein. I'm not going to completely drag Norm Finkelstein as a bad faith actor or a grifter as it pertains to this topic. That would be highly unfair to him. I want to be clear about that, although I know one of y'all is going to say, oh, that Norm Finkelstein is... I'm not about this. Further, the book, The Holocaust Industry, and a lot of his work is really important for developing and criticizing the hold that Zionism has on American institutions. But to quote a random on Twitter that I saw the other day, Norm Finkelstein was low-key stuck saying slick shit about Black studies and complaining about trans people on low-key right-wing podcasts before being pushed into greater prominence after October 7th and then becoming the American voice of anti-Zionism. And y'all don't see the issue there. Like, please tell me, thinking about it now, isn't that kind of a problem?
There is a genre of men and women, majorly men, Jewish, who have been like on a consistent journey of being wronged so often and then course correcting when it is too late. And we valorize them, we champion them, we give them more and more podiums. People who have demonized BDS, for example, for many years and have silenced Palestinian voices who have advocated for BDS for many years are now suddenly embracing it. Or a different example, Peter Beinart, for example, is a man who cheered on the Iraq war very, very loudly for years. And then he was like, I was wrong about that. And this is a man who cheered on Israel for many, 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 many years. And now he is like, I was wrong about that. And he cheered on the two-state solution. And then he was like, I was wrong about that. And they don't stop to think, oh, I have been wrong so often. And yet I am grandstanding. And yet I'm so arrogant. And yet I am speaking with so much clarity. These people they don't have the word perhaps or maybe or I think in the vocabulary. They speak with so much certainty. And right now he is like constantly saying things that are so implicitly or sometimes explicitly racist against Palestinians. And I assure you that in a couple of years, he's going to be like, I was wrong about this. But I think the responsibility falls on him and others like him to have humility, but also the responsibility falls on the viewer and the reader to be a little bit more critical, to not just welcome with open arms anyone who just pretends to be in solidarity with us. And this doesn't apply to just the people on the left who kind of made a name for themselves over speaking over Palestinians. This also applies to our kind of like unconditional embrace of right-wing figures who have suddenly started speaking up about Palestine. I feel as if in the moment we have two extremes. Either you crucify everybody and you want people to be perfect all the time and not have made any mistakes ever. And if they have made mistakes, then you do not engage with them. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is that you just welcome people with open arms. I think the thing is a little bit more nuanced than that. People need to show us how they've changed, what kind of organizational and political commitments have they made since their mistakes, right? And also, if somebody is so good on Palestine, but so bad on immigration, and so bad on Black issues and so bad on women's issues and whatnot, do I really want to be in community with them?
Yeah,
it's an important question.
Is that the champion we want to bring to the forefront? Finkelstein being white and Jewish makes him far more palatable to white sensibilities as it pertains to media around the topic. And that does make him capable and very important as a mouthpiece to forward anti-Zionism in spaces where it may not have had any opportunity to spread. But it does exemplify a major issue on how we get to the point where Owens and her ilk are the vanguard of anti-Zionism as well, which is that, Owens aside, Americans are only interested in the analysis and opinions of white men whenever it comes to serious political discussions, even when those discussions aren't really meant to be led by white men. In fact, especially when those discussions aren't meant to be led by white men. The now famous debate that mostly focuses on Finkelstein calling Destiny a moron on the Lex Friedman podcast is a perfect example of how distorted the real issue has become. Moin Rabini, I apologize if I mispronounced that, is the only Palestinian on this panel, which features 3 accomplished scholars and a professional gamer debating the validity of Palestinian liberation. And of all the figures, Rabini is probably the person who people remember the least from this piece of content. This trivializing of Palestinian liberation in this way is greatly what Muhammad El-Kurd focused on in his book.
Simply put, I'm asking for a little humility. Western knowledge producers, or those using Western voices in their knowledge production, should ask themselves a few questions. Where do Palestinians fit in this work? Do they have any agency, or are they a tool to drive the point across? Are my filmmaking practices extractive? How can I practice responsible authorship? Have I instilled in my project enough cues to incentivize my audience to consume it critically, or am I patting myself on the back? Am I doing the challenging chore of speaking to my bigoted, acrimonious community, accosting my Zionist aunt at the dinner table? Or am I preaching, pandering, really, to the choir? Did I really have to go and see for myself? Or did I ignore a century of Palestinian literature? Am I cognizant of how that refusal to engage local and grassroots knowledge production continues to undermine its value on the world stage, undermining also the value and authority of Palestinian narration? Do I have a class analysis in my work? Do I acknowledge that I get awards for saying similar things to what the student movement has been criminalized, suspended, and censured for saying? Do I name my institutional backing? What are the material and monetary conditions for those whose voices I amplify? Am I only referencing dead guys? What does my works cited page look like?
People like to say they're fighting for Palestinian liberation. They may even think this, but their actions ultimately become highly self-serving, and the greater audience is often too sucked into the clout of it all to be aware of the problem they're contributing to. In fact, they're usually part of the problem. Now, this criticism is probably most relevant when speaking about Candace Owens and the right-wing voices in the topic, but it's still applicable to us on the left, and to me, it's worse that we're dealing with this since we purport to know better. I don't think we're critical enough of how uncritical we are of who we reward with the attention economy on this topic, and the fact that even having an attention economy based on a genocide, to me, is kind of gross in the first place. This is my personal perspective as someone inside this machine. And of all the things I've said in this video, I do want to be clear, this is just me. This is just how I see it. But if you ask me, YouTube and alternative media is no place for serious political education at a grand scale. At best, videos like this will inspire people to go out and really get educated. And in my opinion, anyone you see on any of these screens or podcasts presented themselves as a voice against Zionism, or for Palestinian people who isn't themselves rooted in that struggle, who can't present to you bona fides on their organizing work, is not to be trusted. There's been this memification of anti-Zionism that, while probably useful on some level, especially for communicating ideas quickly and easily and affecting cultural attitudes, but it's still insidious in its unintended consequences of making all of this less serious than it should be. There was a point when writing this video where I was going to call for more content from more creators on the topic, but when I sat back and looked at the actual landscape, I feel like what many people are already doing is actually more responsible, considering how how these platforms work. We do need to keep speaking up for Palestine, but we also need to stay in our lanes and not overreach our capabilities, while also being critical of how we could improve our analysis by engaging more with better scholarship from actual Palestinian scholars. But what I'm getting at is that we need less definitive videos on Palestine from non-historians and more agitative propaganda capable of pulling in new people and spreading a more principled message. If your lane is video games or pop culture, use that lane to bring up Palestinian liberation. Don't enter a historian's lane. And if you're a historian, I don't have a perfect plan of attack, not being a historian, but I guarantee you it probably starts with centering more Palestinian and regional scholars in your research and less of pretty much everyone else. Now, this won't change what Owens and her ilk are able to do because it's a numbers game at the end of the day. And while I have a large channel for a left tuber, it is not a large channel in the grand scheme of how these messages are spread. We can make sure that our analysis of this issue is distinguishable from this America First version. But before we wrap, I do want to again acknowledge that regardless of the quality of the critique, any form of anti-Zionism becoming more popular is fundamentally a good thing for Palestinians, and that has to be understood going forward. However, and I want to be clear here, you don't in fact have to hand it to them in this situation. I don't give full credit to Owens or the right for that change in attitude because of two main reasons. One, and this is really important, the power gain for anti-Israel politicians has only materially manifested in the election of Democrats, most of whom are much further left than the Democrats usually would allow. The Democrats have tried to primary figures like Rashida Tlaib, they have primary people like Jamal Bowman, and further left candidates like Chris Robb have been elected because of progressive voices within the Democratic Party that have pushed them to the forefront. On the flip side, this right-wing turn against Israel has not materialized in any wins for right-wing figures who are critical of Israel. In fact, almost every figure critical of Trump or Israel has been defeated by Trump-backed candidates, winning their primaries 14-1 since 2024. So while there is a clear change in American attitudes towards Israel, that change is only manifesting to the left of the traditional Democratic Party. This undermines any credit that you want to give to Owens, Carlson, Green, or anyone else from the right and what they present with their so-called anti-Zionism. Most importantly, however, while Owens and her ilk are speaking to large audiences about the evils of Israel, it's the Palestinians who have been actively filming their conditions. They've been reporting on the violence they endured and brought their plight to the world stage. The images of their suffering are why regular people have turned against Zionism.
But it's like TikTok and Twitter changed everything when October 7th happened. If TikTok and Twitter did not exist, if social media did not exist, there would have been a total media blackout about what happened in Palestine, about the genocide. You wouldn't have heard about Palestinians talking to you straight up with their phones about what they're facing. You wouldn't have heard about AI genocide. You wouldn't have seen, and it's really disturbing, and it still disturbs me.
The Israel point is an important one, right? I think that Israel for a long time has operated with such impunity that they didn't even consider what it would mean for the world to be watching fully. They've always killed journalists. They've always killed unarmed citizens. But the world was paying attention in a different way. They didn't want anybody to tell the story of what was going on in Gaza unless they were in control of the narrative. And because they believe that Arabs are disposable, Palestinians in particular are disposable, they thought that they could do that. And honestly, if we look at what's happening in terms of international criminal courts, they have operated with impunity. Yeah, I cry, you cry. We have an ongoing list in our Al Jazeera office of people posted up who've been killed since October 7th. And the world keeps ticking, right? There's a way that Israel has operated with impunity because of the United States' support.
All Owens and her ilk have done is incorporated that natural outrage toward human atrocity into clout and political power. And you can rest assured that if there wasn't a convergence of interest between the far right and Palestinians, the far right would not be at all concerned about their plight like they never have been throughout the history of America. I think this is important because while it's dubious to look at Democrats as allies in this struggle, I do want people to see that unlike many of the challenges that face the left, a free Palestine, or at least an Israel that is not funded by America, is a realistic possibility in our lifetimes through traditional political action. There have been presidents as recent as George Bush Jr., believe it or not, to hold firm lines against settlements and military funding. It's not perfect, obviously, but pushing things further is something that that could exist before my children are adults. America's full support of Israel is younger than a lot of your grandparents, and with some concerted effort and watchful oversight, it's possible to push the current anti-Israel sentiment, regardless of where it comes from, into material change in that region as it pertains at least to American policy. And from there, we might see massive progress in other ways. Recently, the aforementioned Norm Finkelstein did an interview where he essentially makes the same observation I'm making in this video. The right can't be trusted on the issue of Gaza.
Am I supposed to believe that Megyn Kelly is up at night worrying about the plight of people in Gaza? The right is not known for its support for national liberation struggles, but we've suddenly discovered this huge outpouring of compassion for poor, brown-skinned Muslims.
However much I agree with Norm here, we have to remember that this is not an excuse to shift responsibility to Palestinians for their desire for liberation. Palestinian activist Laif Marouth responded to Norm in a short essay that anyone calling themselves anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian needs to adhere to. Laif points out two major things. One, the fact of the matter is the American left, as in mainstream platform and power holding left, has failed Gaza, and this is something that I pointed out already. We have mainstream Democrats who are wholly on board with Zionism, as well as nominal progressives who can barely get past liberal Zionism. And the actual anti-Zionists within the establishment Democrats are marginalized or being actively co-opted or primaried. And this brings up the ugly second part, that America first likely means Israel last. Thus, this rising America first Zionism is the best thing going for Palestinian liberation right now from their standpoint. It's not their responsibility to have the correct allies in their liberation efforts. Now, I imagine that many from that region probably will recognize the flaws in America first Zionism and the fact that it could not be trusted long term. However, with the boot on their neck as we speak, I cannot blame them for disregarding the red flags if it means change. But the same cannot be said for us here in the States. Aside from the fact that we owe it in solidarity to Palestinian people and their cause to frontline their assessment of their situation, to employ the core of their analysis when we open our mouths to criticize Zionism in Israel. I could spend more time arguing about the core of white supremacy and anti-blackness within Zionism, or looking at its connection to colonial frameworks in ways that my black radical lens tends to want to focus on. I could use a more intersectional lens to focus on the unique treatment of men under Zionist occupation, the usage of rape and sexual assault in order to emasculate them, as well as how Palestinian liberation efforts have always featured women and they're being erased in westernized images of what this struggle looks like. There's tons of unique threads to follow on this topic, but this isn't a topic to just talk about. This is a humanitarian crisis that needs more than anything to have its voices and leaders upheld. Decolonial theory tells us that the colonized must and will eventually liberate themselves
by any means necessary.
So it's not mine or anyone else's role to speak for Palestinians. Instead, the goal should be to carve a pathway to allow them to speak for themselves. There should be more mention of the work of Muhammad El-Kurd, Laif Marouth, and countless other scholars, including Lost Futures, who has made several videos on the topic that have not gotten views or really a lot of attention in our space. And all this should be happening instead of 55 podcasts featuring Norm Finkelstein. To put it in, again, simple terms, imagine if the leading voice for Black liberation in America was a white man. Imagine if the leading voice for LGBTQ rights was a straight person. Or imagine if the most popular framework for understanding white supremacy in America didn't come from Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Kwame Ture or any of the well-versed, well-studied visionaries in Black struggle that have explained us how white supremacy works. Instead, what if we frontlined something that Dr. Umar Johnson said, or worse yet, Thomas Sowell? Which, if you know anything about Black politics, then you know there's been plenty of people, mostly white people, that have tried to tell us that Thomas Sowell is who we should be listening to. That is what I think is happening with this America First anti-Zionism. We're allowing genuinely anti-Semitic white supremacists to be the leading voices for anti-Zionism in the States. Palestinians deserve better than this. People like you, Dr. Fatima, this person you just showed me that I never heard of, Bess D. Marks, are flying under the radar. That's part of the thing I want to get across in the video is for the audience to understand better their role in all of this.
I think if I would say something to your audience is that all of us know that we could make little impact on our viewers. Sure, we might affect them emotionally, we might affect them in an education manner, but when it comes to Palestine, education is the least we can do, right? And this is kind of like why I admire Noah Samson. Noah went out there with massive fundraising. He changed his entire channel overnight to Palestine and dedicated himself to Palestine, and has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Palestine. And, you know, I admire that. He's done something for the Palestinian people. And, you know, for me, I feel kind of depressed when I make a video and I talk in the end of my video about, yeah, you've learned something from this video. Yeah, it's been a dense video on Palestine, but what are you going to do? If you're angry, what are you going to do? Are you just going to, you know, click off my video or share my video and that's it? That's not what I want you to do. I want my viewers and the viewers watching this video themselves to stand up for Palestine. And I'm not telling people out there to just dedicate their lives to talking about Palestine all the time. You know, I'm not telling YouTubers to change their YouTube channels to focus only on Palestine. That's way too much to ask for. But it's that in that silence, you're working with the media. You're doing what the media wants you to do, which is just shut up and to not focus on Palestine, to not advocate it, and to tell people that you yourself could go out there and help a Palestinian.
Watching this video, posting about Palestine, making more videos like this should not be the extent of your efforts to liberate Palestine. At a certain point while thinking about making this video, I was gonna say we need more videos like it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized we really don't need any more coverage of Palestine from YouTubers. We need action in the name of Palestine from everyone. And not just Palestine, but Cuba and the Congo and Sudan and anywhere where American imperialism is doing what it always does. When I see videos like this, when I see comments around videos like this, the thing that I notice is that people watch these videos and it gives them a sense of relief. And we don't deserve that. What you did here at the end of the day was consume a commercial product, a meticulously designed piece of media meant to entertain and educate you on a platform that is, again, a collaborator with Zionists and the American government that literally works for Planeteer, a tech company that provides resources for Zionists to do data mining and surveillance. If it weren't for the fact that I realized how many people had fell for the right-wing anti-Zionist grift, I would never have made this video for the sake of not contributing to that problem as I see it. Not because I don't believe in a free Palestine, but because I don't believe in consumption-based activism or edutainment that does anything more than placate people versus activate people. YouTube is not a real place to enact or even inspire social change. It's designed to keep you here, and I need you to understand that here is not where you are needed. You are needed outside. As hard as I worked on this video, it will not reach the same size audience as content that spreads information, as Candace Owens and her ilk. But what gives us the edge is if everyone who watches this video does something to address the problem, goes outside. You need to get involved in some form of anti-fascist organizing, not because that will directly lead to a free Palestine, but because that is what will set us on that path. It's not just that watching videos isn't praxis. It's also that watching videos often will leave a lot of people with a sense of doomerism, feeling overwhelmed and disempowered and defeated once the grandness of the problem is illustrated to them by someone like me. And aside from not wanting you to feel that way, I also want you to know that there is a way to remove that feeling, and that's by getting active. Research shows that whatever feeling of doomerism you have, once you start actually organizing and working directly toward the political and social goals that you say you desire, that sense of doomerism goes away every time. I'm not going to ask you to leave a comment. I'm not going to ask you to do much more in sharing the video. I'm going to ask that you go and get active, because that is what we need to do. So with that in mind, I want to highlight an actual place to show support. This is not the Nebula read. Save your money for this instead. Sarsour and his project are seeking to provide direct aid to Palestinians in his community. Sarsour is simply making art, seeking to tell the story of Palestinians as a Palestinian while using the attention and funds it garners to provide as much aid as is possible in a variety of ways. If you can, please give to his project.
So I wrote this poem that is called Walls, Windows, Anador that describe this situation, and I will share it with you right now. Trump, obviously complicit, hates us as he seeks to immigrate us. And as they plan our evacuation, this forced immigration, they leave us to death in all its forms. As he cynically acknowledges the scenes of death and destruction around our homes, he refuses to say who is behind this orchestrated play. The devil in front of you all, the sole cause of it in whole. The destruction was never a downfall. He's proud that he kept the war machine rolling. The death kept enrolling as heads kept polling. He smiles with a smirk and eye rolling in disapproval of peace talks presented on the table. Happy with his three goals and his war label. Ironic, true. But what's more ironic is us being envious of the people who live next door, who have walls, windows, and a door. I hear one saying as his voice breaks, he asks while tears fall and his heart aches, do you have walls, windows, or doors? Or is it just a tent like mine with lots of bores? Can you host me? My tent is leaking, my kids are freaking, I am freaking, hard to stay peeking as the cold keeps peeking from the shredded plastic that made our fears reeking. My plastic door and windows couldn't hold, can I borrow some plastic to fix them before it gets cold? My body parts are frozen, work on in fear to prevent my kids' tear and their souls from falling into this sphere by the cold, the glacial teeth who keeps on calling. Winter used to be the favorite season in Gaza, with the smell of baking goods, hot beverages on the seashores of livelihoods, and the word of fire camps that hosted at every chance with barbecues, happiness and joy in all avenues. Now, these same shores are their own source of despair, a daily life we have beyond repair. We used to rush to our homes when we felt the cold and the fun was done and the night was cold. Now, there is no place to rush to, as the children cry and the parents weep when tents start to fly with souls to the heavens deep. Winter is no longer a friend. Cold is no longer fun to play pretend. Campfires only tire our exhausted bodies that long to retire. And as ironic as that sounds, we only need walls, windows, and a door. That's all we ask for. So invest in giving us homes, don't send us away. We have already lost too much up till today, so let us stay on the land that hold our loved ones in its belly, and where all of our memories lie buried under rubble and houses that are chilly. We don't ask for too much for you to ignore, just walls, windows, and a door. Thank you.
As I've done before in other political videos, I will pin the top comment as a place for people to bring attention for other related initiatives or organizing opportunities. As usual with that, please use wisdom on what you share publicly, and please don't use that comment as a place to argue or debate or air any grievances. You can do that in the rest of the comment section if you want. All that said, despite what some of you keep saying about it, yes, this video is only possible because of my streaming service Nebula. By now, the first episode of my original series, Goon World, is out, with the second episode set to release in July. You can find out more about that by listening to the following. Nebula is an independent streaming service created by YouTubers that has evolved from a place where we get to house videos not treated well by the YouTube algorithm and transformed into a place where some of the internet's most talented creators get to make pretty much whatever we can imagine, and with your help, fund. For me, it's been a few things. There's a video where I briefly talk about the complex masculinity of Tupac, a short documentary on the concept of whiteness, and most recently and significantly, a deep dive into the world of pornography consumption, addiction, and sex work called Goon World. Goon World is exactly the type of project Nebula was made for, as it's just subject matter that won't be allowed to be monetized on YouTube. Trust me, I've tried in the past. But by doing it on Nebula, I get to level things up a bit and work on my terms. I interview psychologists, sexologists, sex workers, OnlyFans models, and actual gooners to dive heavily into what this world that we all know is there but pretend not to see, and how it's actually affecting us in modern society. The first episode is out right now. The second will be out early August, with the final episodes to drop soon after. I have so many other ideas for projects like this that don't work on YouTube as a platform, and Nebula allows me options to bring things to life on my terms. But it can only do that with your help. By signing up, you won't just be helping me and getting access to uncensored and uncut versions of my content. You'll also be getting tons of that from other creators, along with hours upon hours of content from narrative podcasts, original short films, reality shows, travel shows, all independent and all at your fingertips if you follow the QR code on the screen and get 50% off a year subscription. I appreciate that you've made it this far. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to Nebula for sponsoring the video. Peace.
Flowers for the living, for the living.